I worked for a sheriff's department in East Texas for the first 2 years that I was a cop. I currently work at another department in the same area. I'm going to have to change names so I don't get into any legal trouble or upset surviving family. Also, I don't want to rustle any feathers with colleagues. The law enforcement community is very tight-knit, and egos bruise like bananas. Some of you will probably deduce what county I'm talking about from the few clues that I give you anyways. But I gotta change up the story enough for plausible deniability. You know the drill. Standard creepypasta stuff. My county was as big as Dallas or Austin County, but only has a population of 14,000 people in it. A lot of places you can only travel on foot. It's as bayou as it can get and still be in Texas. Creeks and rivers run through it like veins, proning the area to flash floods. The most common sight is tightly packed forest pushed up against blacktop roads. The most common way to die is falling asleep at the wheel or being ambushed by suicidal deer. Since there's not a lot of people and these people are poor, it means deputies are paid crap. Not that I was only in it for the pay. I loved being a cop. I pledged to be one of the good ones that stuck to his ideals and didn't become cynical. Well, I stuck to my ideals, but I became more cynical each passing day. What's worse than the pay is the safety concerns. There are only 2 deputies out on a given night, one for the south end and one for the north. This means your only backup is usually 20 to 40 minutes away from you. And if your partner is also handling an emergency, well, then you're out of luck. This made the area seem like one of the last remaining bits of the Wild West. You really had to keep your wits sharp and watch your six when all alone in the woods. As romantic as the idea was of being like Walker Texas Ranger, it almost got me killed. It was the perfect storm of circumstances. My county had suffered severe flooding the week before this story had happened. The water was going down in most parts, but some places were still flooded. Another great thing was our radios had been down all day. Someone was coming to fix them in the morning, and the rain began pouring again. The call came in around midnight about a man beating on a woman's door. The man was demanding to be let in out of the rain. The woman said that she was alone with her baby and needed a cop fast. I was in the dispatch located in the jail side of the sheriff's department when the call came in. My dispatcher, who was like a mother hen, gave me a look. The "I got a live one" look. Her eyebrows raised as she snapped at me to get my attention. Her phone tucked to her ear while her other hand typed furiously. I listened to her repeat information out loud for me as I scribbled down the caller's address in my notepad. It was in the flash flood zone. It was passable, but the continuing storm was changing this quick. Another hour of hard rain would cut it off from the rest of the world. My dispatcher swiveled in her chair to look right at me, her face serious. "Call me on your phone when you get close. The radios are still down, so I'll call you every 10 minutes for a security check." "Got it," I said, as I spun around to hurry to my patrol car. "I let the South End deputy know what you got in case he needs to get to you," she quipped as the heavy door to the jail slammed behind me. I appreciated the gesture from her, but having backup almost an hour away didn't mean much if things popped off. Backup could be coming from the moon for all the difference it made. I squeezed myself into the crowded front seat of my patrol vehicle. I hadn't even entered the address into my onboard GPS when my phone had started ringing. It was dispatch. "What you got?" I asked. There was an unusual pause before she spoke. I could hear the concern in her voice. "Hey, just learned this. Our caller said that it may be Ezekiel Burrows out there." I paused before turning the key in the ignition. This was not good. I had dealt with Zeke before. It was back when I was a rookie. I'll have to put this story on hold to fill you in with a flashback episode first. I had been working for about 2 weeks at the time. I was still riding shotgun with my FTO. An anonymous caller rang the sheriff's department complaining that Zeke and his older brother were driving around pointing guns at people and firing into the air. My FTO had been a stereotype of an old county cop who was about to retire. He was laid back and calmly gave instructions between drags of a cigarette. He wore a bushy white walrus mustache and cowboy hat that fitted him perfectly. When the call came across the car radio, his demeanor flipped like a switch. He sat forward and flicked his cigarette out the window. His face darkened. "Alright, deputy, this could get dangerous. Stay alert, stay close, and do everything that I tell you." We were burning towards the call pretty fast when he offered this additional piece of information. "I know these two brothers, they've been known to fight with police. Don't be afraid to go hands-on if you need to," he said with his slow demeanor. And my body dumped a ton of adrenaline for a fight-or-flight response as I felt my stomach turn. I was glad that my FTO was so calm for me. In those days, I used to be ashamed of the butterflies in my stomach. I thought it meant that I was weak or a coward. Now I realize it's my body's way of protecting itself, and I needed to embrace the feeling. We found the brothers slow rolling around in a Hutter green Dodge Neon. It was missing a driver's side mirror and had a giant hole where a red brake light should be. It was great when they made our job easy. We initiated a felony takedown. That's pretty much when you point your weapon at the suspect vehicle while standing behind your open car door. You give loud, verbal commands like, "Driver, step out of the vehicle slowly." Anyway, we had both of them pulled out and detained in handcuffs. Nothing of note really happened except for there being 2 shotguns and 3 rifles in the back seat. Ammo and shell casings everywhere. It's not illegal in the state of Texas, but highly suspicious. The original caller wanted to remain anonymous, so we had nothing to prove that they were firing from the vehicle. My FTO dealt with Zeke's older brother while I talked with Zeke. I can't remember the brother's name. We will just call him Turd for now. My FTO had our dispatch run both of their names to see if they had any active warrants. So we got some tense and awkward minutes with the brothers while they waited to see if they were going to jail or not. A Turd ran at the mouth for the duration of the stop, called us every racist and vulgar thing in his extensive vocabulary of no-no words. And me, being a rookie, got a little flustered at some of the things he had allegedly done to my mother, so I turned my attention to Zeke. Zeke stood there downcast and drenched in sweat. It was only 80 degrees, but he looked like he was about to suffer a heat stroke. His whole body began to tremble slightly and sway back and forth. "You okay, Zeke?" I asked as I stepped closer to him. I thought that I might have had to catch him if he passed out on me. You see, Zeke smelled like hot garbage, and it was pretty overpowering. A mixture of sweat and butt. I didn't want to touch him, but he was cuffed behind his back. I couldn't let him tip over with nothing but his head to break the fall. Lucky for me, Zeke straightened up when I reached for him. His eyes bulged as he looked right at me, his teeth bared in a grimace. "Is this one gonna kill me, Jesus?" he whispered in a raspy voice, his vacant eyes locked with mine. "Oh no, Zeke, you're just being detained while we check if it's good to let you and your brother go," I said while trying to hide how creeped out I was. Zeke paused and tilted his head to the side slightly. A smirk touched the edge of his mouth as he nodded like he was in agreement with something. The next thing that he said was something really strange. It's been a while since that day, so my memory is foggy, but I remember it being something like, "I'm supposed to tell you to remember my face during the massacre." "What?" I said as I turned to face him squarely. His brother must have heard the change in my tone of voice. He leaned over to yell past my FTO. "Hey, keep your mouth shut, Zeke. Let me handle these pigs." Zeke considered his brother calmly and replied, "You will be alone when you die, brother." Turd's eyes widened and I saw pure fear flash across his face. He scoffed and tried to play it off by laughing, but I could see through his bravado. His brother had scared him. Long story short, both brothers came back clear of warrants. The original 911 caller still wanted to remain anonymous, and this meant that we had no witness to any alleged illegal activity. With nothing to hold them for, we let them loose. But I do remember one more creepy thing that Zeke said. When they were uncuffed, the two walked back to their car. Turd went for the driver's seat and Zeke went to sit in the seat behind him. "What, I'm your chauffeur now?" Turd asked angrily. Zeke was staring at something in the passenger seat while shaking his head slowly. "No," Zeke replied coolly. "He's already sitting there. I'm not gonna make him mad. He's already been staring at you all day." And Turd said something muffled to Zeke and got into the driver's seat. As they drove away, I could see Zeke sitting in the back, half turned and pointing at something beside his brother in the passenger seat. And before they had pulled out of earshot, I could hear Turd begin to scream profanities at his brother. So, that's the previously on the TV show of my life. That was my first run-in with Zeke, and now it seemed that I was racing to him again years later. Zeke's little origin story always sat different with me. I never encountered him in person after that initial contact, but word of his exploits would always reach me. An elderly woman had her door kicked in by the two brothers. She was beaten and robbed. Didn't call the cops until a week later because her grandson made her. She was too terrified to give a witness statement, but the grandson told me the entire street knew that it was Zeke and Turd. An outdoor birthday party canceled when Zeke popped up out of the woods and started firing his shotgun in the air. I spent the rest of the night trying to reel in trigger-happy relatives looking for Zeke in the woods. A caller that we 90% knew was Zeke kept calling dispatch and threatening to kill the sheriff on recorded lines. He was mad that his brother was arrested. Problem was, Turd was arrested by a neighboring county, not us. It was evident that Zeke was sliding further and farther to the dark side. He was the Riddler to my Batman. I could never catch up with him, he just left problems for me to deal with. But now maybe I had him, and I could physically put cuffs on him. My GPS said that I was 10 minutes out from the caller's house. It was going to be a little bit longer because of the downpour. Visibility was low and I could feel my ride trying to hydroplane a few times. When I was about 2 minutes out, the road before me just seemed to disappear. The white lines had just vanished as water flooded the road. Turning on my takedown lights didn't reveal where the high water ended, so I stepped out of my car to take a better look. In the darkness, all I could hear was the sporadic thumping of droplets hitting my raincoat, and the mechanical back and forth of my wipers in overdrive. Before me was a flat plain of water rippling from millions of raindrops. Every few seconds the area would illuminate with lightning, showing me the deep water continued around the bend in the road. My mind went back to the PS1 days of Silent Hill. First thing I did as a terrified 5th grader was try to leave the town, only to find an endless drop-off into the dense fog. I had the similar feeling of dread now, but this time it was an impromptu lake and not a cliff, and I was running towards the danger, not away from it. I was weighing my options and considering letting dispatch know that it was impassable. I was in a Charger, not a Tahoe. Maybe Zeke found somewhere else to stay dry. I mean, he hasn't broken any laws yet. My phone began to ring. It was dispatch. Before I could even say hello, I was met with, "You there yet, deputy?" "I'm around the corner, there's." "He's back," my dispatcher half shouted. "She's saying that he's kicking the door and beating on windows. I can hear him threatening to hurt her in the background." At this moment, only one course of action was clear. I guess I'd be swimming if I had to. I slowly but steadily submerged my vehicle into the dark waters. I was praying that it wouldn't drown out as the waters rose to about 2 feet high around me. Water began seeping in from the bottoms of the doors as I made the bend in the road. I could see land before me as I began to get more traction and pull out of the water. I gassed my vehicle to give it one last lurch to exit the water and spin out into the muddy road. I hit the brakes to get a quick layout of my surroundings. The red stop sign of a four-way intersection reflected back at me. I was now in a small residential community. My GPS told me that the caller's house was across the intersection and 3 houses down on the left. It was hard to see it through the downpour, but I could see the road disappeared under the water again. I got out and began to walk. I wasn't going to risk getting my car stuck and trapped in the driveway. As I sloshed forward, a tension began to build in the back of my neck. Silent lightning would periodically illuminate me in a sea of ripples. A cold feeling surrounded my thoughts. A black hole opened in my stomach, sucking all confidence from me. This was new. I had been scared before, but fight or flight always set in with a burst of nervous energy. But this was surreal. I felt like I was dreaming. I felt dread. I felt alone. I was in water up to my knees when I reached the yard. I finally got some higher ground the closer that I came to the front door. I squished around to my left and my right, checking the sides of the house. The house was a double-sized trailer elevated 3 feet off the ground on stilts. I had to walk up the steep stairs to knock on the door. "Sheriff's Department," I yelled over the rain. I jumped back down with a splash of the narrow steps and I scanned the darkness. I heard rumbling at the door as it opened a couple of inches. I could see a feminine face peeking out at me. "Can I see a badge or something?" came a fearful voice. I cocked my head at this before I realized that I was completely covered in my yellow Wyatt Earp raincoat. I unbuttoned my trench coat and showed my flashlight on my badge and duty belt. "He was here just now," she said nervously. Her eyes darted back and forth, scanning the darkness. I could hear the frantic cries of her child from deeper in the house. "Lock the door, but stay by it for me. I'll check around back. So don't worry if you hear me making noise back there." I waited until I heard her lock the door before pulling out my gun and circling around to the left. I circled around the entire house slowly, making the corners with a deliberate slowness. My small but powerful flashlight held at the center of my chest with my gun at low ready. The entire perimeter of the house checked clear. My head was on a swivel, checking the thick forest pushing in from the darkness. I even checked her small car, pulled on the doors to see if they were left unlocked. There was nothing suspicious. He was gone. But I felt eyes on me. The cold dread sat heavy on my stomach, making me slightly nauseous. I could feel the nervous tingle at the base of my skull, making me want to turn my head frequently. And then the obvious realization hit me, causing an extra punch to the gut. He was under the house. It was 3 feet off the ground. Me being an idiot had just been walking around him. I was standing with my back a foot away from the house. I immediately dropped to one knee with a splash and twist to aim my weapon and light under the house, my mind half expecting the jump scare from Zeke, akin to the scene where they first showed the xenomorph in the vents on Alien. My fingers slowly loosens off the trigger as I saw nothing but interlocking planks of wood, cobwebs, and more darkness. I couldn't see fully under the house because it had been used to store old junk like a lawnmower, sandbags, and old bicycles. I stared intently for a while, trying to make out a human form. Every time I moved the blinding beam of light, it caused dark shadows to dance underneath, mimicking movement. I wasn't satisfied that he wasn't under there, but I couldn't see a thing. I backed away from the house and began to think. He was close by and he was probably watching me. I comforted myself with the realization that he was scared of me, and I had a captive audience. He was either under the house or waiting in the forest, trying not to make a sound by running. "Zeke," I projected my voice with as much authority as I could. "This is the Sheriff Department. We know it's you out there." I did a 360 scan around me with my flashlight as I slowly continued. "You haven't broken any laws yet. Go home now and that can be the end of it. If I have to come back, you are definitely going to jail, I promise you that." As I finished my speech, I let the silence hang in the air for a dramatic effect. Thunder rolled in the distance to punctuate my seriousness. Feeling confident in my ultimatum, I sloshed my way back to my patrol car, but don't get me twisted, dear listener. I'm not inept or cowardly. I had a plan and leaving was a ruse. When I got to my car, I called dispatch to tell her the plan. I told her to let our caller know that I was going to drive back to the stop sign down the road and dark out to wait for Zeke to return. Soon I was back in my car with all the lights out, staring down the dark road towards the house. As I sat in the darkness listening to the chaotic storm envelop me, I checked my phone. Only 10 minutes had passed when I swear it had been an eternity. The strange dreamlike feeling flooded over me again. I had a quick thought telling me that I had never gone to the house in the first place. I had been just sitting here imagining the whole series of events that had just happened. Unsure, I patted my ankles to see if they were still wet. They weren't. I never trudged in the water to check on the scared mother, but I had remembered doing it. I don't know, things are so foggy. I had the sudden urge to cry and I didn't know why. I just felt so scared, so alone. Nothing made sense. I fought back a sob. A harsh voice spoke to me, cutting through my confusion like a poisoned knife through my brain. It said that I should just end it. I should just use the tool holstered on my hip. I put my head against the coolness of my window. Hot tears ran down my face as my hand fumbled with the retention locks on my holster. The coolness of the window was my only relief before the end. Good thing it was snowing. The snow always made me sad as it formed a white coat of ice on my windows. Wait a minute, snow? In Texas? I jolted with a gasp in my seat as if waking from a dream. Maybe I was, a micro-dream. I had had a couple of those in Marine boot camp due to sleep deprivation. But why had it happened now? I shook my head vigorously to get my bearing back. The dark thoughts fled from me. I realized the power on the street must have gone out while I was in my reverie, because no light was coming from any of the houses. Visibility was zero and the storm was at a deafening cacophony by now. Alone with just my thoughts in the darkness, I doubted my plan. I had had enough of my mind playing tricks on me, and I wondered how long I should sit here like a creeper until I had to go back to regular patrol. My phone lit up and I jumped to answer it before it could even ring. I immediately recognized my dispatcher's voice, but it sounded too far away. "He's back, right now he..." Her voice cut out as the call dropped and it chimed in my ear. Yeah, sometimes these cell towers out here were spotty, especially during storms. Now I had a useless phone that I couldn't call backup with. My only hope was my dispatcher would get my partner rolling my way. He was around 30 minutes to 1 hour away, remember? As I slammed my door behind me and began slogging through the rain, I thought to myself, on nights like this, I knew the future. I could just imagine the darkest timeline of events and it would happen. The thought of my cell phone crapping out had been a whisper in my mind since the night began. I didn't bring it to the forefront of my thoughts in hope that it wouldn't manifest, but it came true along with all the other bad vibes of the night. I prayed and no more latent fears came to fruition, especially the deepest fear that we all suppressed every time we wear a badge. I was splashing through the mini ocean leading up the front porch when I heard the screaming of the child. Not the normal screaming of a fussy infant, but a sharp, raspy scream, as if the child's throat was hurting from the exertion. Out came my gun again as I quickly ran towards these steep stairs. I did a quick duck under to scan the house with my light before I positioned myself beside the narrow stairs. I didn't go up them due to hearing about cops being shot off porches through closed doors as soon as they had announced themselves. I banged down the lower part of the door with a fist and announced myself. I waited a beat for an answer or a gunshot. None came though, and I weighed my options. I didn't have consent or a search warrant, but what I did have was a good old exigent circumstance. Exigent circumstance is what firefighters use to kick your door in when they smell smoke. As long as I believe danger is on the other side of the door, I can ram it in. The baby's screams became choking coughs, and I heard something thump loudly inside. I hopped up the steps and prepared to launch my shoulder into the door. A tiny voice in my head urged me to see if the door was unlocked. It should still be locked from last time, but I tried it anyways. It opened a crack and I was hit with an awful stench. The closest thing that I can compare it to is somebody with a severe sinus infection waking up with morning breath, having eaten rotten eggs and they blew in your face. I pulled my head back to see a bulging eye staring at me from the top corner of the door. But this eye reflected like a cat's or a raccoon. It stared down at me with a dotted purple. In the split second before I kicked the door open, I could see the eye glint purple and retreat. I could hear the growl of a dog as the door swung open to the darkness within. My flashlight and my weapon swung around frantically, searching for a dog or a tall intruder with purple eyes. I saw nothing but a small living room. A TV to my right, a couch to my left. Counter in front of me separating the living room from the kitchen. I could hear the child screaming and coughing from the hallway to my left. I took a couple of tentative steps towards the cries when a figure rushed out of the hallway towards me. I let out a yell and leveled my Glock to fire. I thank God that I froze for an instant instead of shooting reflexively. In the split second that followed, I saw the mother with her head tilted sideways and her eyes rolled back. Her arms were trailing limply behind her as she fell. I sidestepped out of her way and she crumpled to the floor beside me with a thud. Hindsight 2020, maybe I should have caught her, but maybe part of me knew that she had been thrown, so I kept my weapon aimed down the hallway. Or that's what I tell myself anyways. The hallway was only 6 feet long, a bedroom to the right and left with a bathroom in the middle. I had been in countless trailers with this layout. The bathroom door was closed, so whoever threw her could be to the right or to the left taking cover. I could see that both of the doors were open. I spared a glance down at the woman and she was on her side facing me. Young and attractive, she was only in a light shirt and underwear. Her eyes were open and she was breathing in quick and short bursts. Her eyes had a trance-like stare and I could see her skin glistened with a layer of sweat. I couldn't see blood or physical injuries on her, but she reminded me of a fish taken out of water, slowly dying. When I returned my gaze to the hallway, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It appeared the hallway had gotten longer. Where my flashlight had once illuminated the bathroom door, now there was only pitch blackness. I moved my flashlight back and forth to reveal the darkness was a fixed object, like a cloud at the lip of the doorway. Even as I squinted and tried to grasp what I was seeing, the darkness had seemed to grow closer. It leaked out like a fog into the living room. The door frame faded to blackness and then the walls around it, and then parts of the couch beside it. The best way that I can explain is that it looked like the world in front of me was disappearing, being swallowed up by the void. The dark reached across the room to flood after me. I looked down to see the world drop off into nothingness about a foot away from me. The bare legs of the woman laying beside me had already been consumed by it. I tried in vain to wave the darkness away with my light, but to no avail. I backed into the TV and knocked it over. The familiar panic began to boil over within me as the dark whispers tore through my mind again. It was the same despair that I had felt in the care. I wasn't afraid of dying on the job, but this wasn't different. What was this darkness? What unimaginable terror waited for me in the approaching void? Would it take me to hell? If I died here, would God even see me? The darkness was right out of arm's reach when the glow of my flashlight was snuffed out and I was plunged into absolute darkness. My last light of hope disappearing caused a primal scream to build up in my throat. One last terrified plea before the madness overtook me. Oh God! Oh Jesus! I blinked rapidly as my flashlight sprung back to life, illuminating the room around me. The unnatural darkness had retreated. I blinked repeatedly as the horrid thoughts flew from me, leaving me shaking and whimpering. I fought the urge to run out of the door and forget stupid ideas like honor and duty. As I supported myself against the TV leaning against the wall, I began to catch my breath. I did a couple rounds of combat breathing to lower my racing heart. I also let out a curse word every other exhale. I had a job to do, and I knew that I had to replace paralyzing fear with something else. Life had taught me anger could override fear and push you past exhaustion in a pinch. I also steadied myself with a mental checklist. I would finish this call, I would find the baby, call an ambulance for the mom, and stop Zeke, or whatever it was out here. And then I could go 10-8 and drink coffee at the office and everything would be like normal. I knelt down to check on the mother. She wouldn't respond to anything that I asked her. Her pupils were as big as saucers and showed no reaction to my light. A brief pat down revealed no apparent injuries. But then I heard it again, the soft cry of an infant. But it wasn't coming from the hallway, it sounded closer. I shot up and immediately saw a figure to the right of my periphery. I twirled to highlight a dark figure of a person standing in the kitchen. The figure's back was turned to me with his shoulders hunched. It wore a ratty black raincoat, torn and frayed. "Let me see your hands," I yelled. The figure didn't budge. I could hear him mumbling as he bobbed his shoulder. "Hey, listen to me. I swear to God I'll shoot you. Hands up and turn around slowly." I could hear him start softly cooing. "But my hands are full, deputy," he croaked as he slowly turned around. It was Zeke, and he was cradling the baby in his arms. My whole body tensed up at this sight. The child couldn't have been more than a year old. I could see the child moving its arms and wriggling about. Thank God for that. But Zeke's grip was firmly around the base of its skull. His disgusting hand palming its delicate head like he was holding a baseball. The dirty nail of his pointer finger gently tapping the child's nose. I mentally weighed my options. Seeing Zeke holding the child reminded me of how terrified I felt when I first held my newborn nephew. He was so fragile, I thought that I could crush him on accident. I knew Zeke was playing upon that fear to keep me at bay. I could shoot him in the face. It wouldn't be the hardest shot to make. He was not but 7 feet from me, but he would drop the baby. As if sensing my thoughts, Zeke let go of the child's head and it dangled upside down by the leg. Now the child commenced the screaming as it swung back and forth like a pendulum. Zeke outstretched his arm, presenting the baby to me, purposefully holding the baby directly in front of the muzzle of my gun. "Take the shot, kill the bad guy, save the family," Zeke hissed. "It's what you trained for all these years," he continued as he took a step towards me, shortening the distance to about 4 feet. I could see the tears pouring out of the child's chubby face, running down its forehead to sprinkle to the floor. I pulled my gun away from the child and held it close to my chest, terrified to have something so dangerous so close to something so precious. I took a half step back when I realized that I was losing my one advantage. Zeke thought that I had tunnel vision on shooting him. He expected me to step back and keep my distance like cops were trained to do, but I always liked a good fight. I quickly came up with a plan to holster my weapon while rushing him. I would grab the baby with my offhand while giving him a low kick right to the knee. I would catch him off guard by springing my attack in the middle of telling him something that everybody knew. "Zeke, listen to me, you have the right to remain silent." My gun started to lower to my holster, my offhand pointing the light in his eyes. "Anything you say can be used against you." A grin began to widen on Zeke's face. "If you cannot afford a..." I tensed to attack. Zeke whipped the baby into the air. Time slowed around me as I saw the child arch upwards to almost hit the ceiling. I must have instinctively dropped my weapon in light as my arms reached to catch the child as it descended. My hands searched the darkness where my brain predicted the fallen child should be. I felt its soft body and eagerly pulled the child to my chest. The instant that my brain confirmed that I had secured the infant, My eyesight exploded with stars as my head rocked back. While reeling backwards, another blow hit the side of my right knee. I buckled and fell to my back, the gear in my duty belt jamming painfully into me. The entire time my arms desperately wrapped around the screaming child. I immediately began frantically searching the ground around me with my right hand. I couldn't let Zeke get my weapon. I began to sit up and roll to my side in a desperate attempt to shield the baby. I received a crushing knee to the belly as Zeke landed on me with all his weight. I let out a grunt of pain and wrapped the child tighter to my chest. He straddled me and pulled himself closer by the collar of my overvest. I could smell his telltale stench cascading off me, his enlarged eyes staring into mine. I realized with horror that Zeke had no intention of going for my gun. With a crazed smile on his face, he embraced me in a hug and began to squeeze. He was going to squeeze me to squeeze the life out of the baby. I had to recall my surging right hand to push back against Zeke. We struggled like that for what seemed like an eternity. He was mounted on top of me, giving me a bear hug, and I desperately tried pushing him away with my right hand while shielding the baby with my left. I knew the amount of force that he was putting on me was unnatural. He was wiry and about 6 inches shorter than me. I had at least 40 pounds on the guy and I was in decent shape. But I felt my back crack as I gasped as my muscles were quickly pushed to the point of muscle failure. The poor child began to wheeze as our bodies sandwiched him. I was getting desperate and my mind brought up a memory that I had tucked away for a rainy day, hoping that I never had to use it. I remembered a salty former devil dog SWAT instructor teaching us room clearing tactics in the academy. It was the end of the day and he began to share war stories about his time in the Corps. Most people don't know the quickest way to kill somebody is putting your thumb right through the bad guy's eye socket, he had told us with a wicked smile, mimicking the action by thrusting his gnarled thumb with a quick jab. Straight into the brain, he finished as he twisted his thumb and made a squish sound with his mouth. Yeah, my body cringed, just like yours did as I heard this. He must have seen the group of us cadets physically withdraw and continued. The trick is getting your brain to override your sense of basic human decency and kill another human in this horrific way. Your mind will fight you on it. It's not natural to want to do this to your fellow man. Even now that you know it, you won't be able to do it if the time comes. I was used to the mind games and hazing from alpha military types, trying to scare us into quitting. I thought on what he said that day, unsure if I could kill or maim someone in such a horrible way. I would have to exhaust all other options. But now as I lay on my back, my body failing and a child being crushed between us, I had to dig deep to survive. Zeke blinked for the first time during this whole confrontation. A look of realization had passed over him. He grinned even wider and began to chuckle. He released me from his hug and quickly grabbed my head with both hands, his thumbs moving from my eyes. I closed my eyes as I felt his dirty thumbnails scrape across my eyelids. Panic leapt inside me as I realized what he was doing. Even though my eyes were closed, I had a mental picture where he was. My right hand struck out and my thumb pierced through something smooth and soft. Warm liquid immediately engulfed my hand and splashed across my face. I didn't realize I was screaming until the copper-tasting liquid had poured into my mouth. I could taste what it was and I knew what I had done, but I had to open my eyes to see. Zeke's grip had slackened enough to open my eyes to peek at the damage. Sure enough, my thumb was deeply embedded into Zeke's left eye socket. He still grinned maniacally as the blood oozed out of him. I pushed him up and away from me as I bucked and twisted frantically. He finally rolled off to my left and my thumb came free of his eye socket. I heard him kicking and thumping away from me as he retreated into the darkness. I sat up with the child and quickly searched to my right for my gun. I found it quickly and snatched it up and scanned the room. I didn't see Zeke, but I scanned back and forth repeatedly. The child resumed its deafening scream and I could feel my heart pounding through my entire body. After a couple of moments of pointing my weapon at the dark and cradling the child, my mind began to work again. I noticed how strange my weapon felt in my blood-covered hand. I noticed the screaming baby sounded loud and healthy, and I noticed that we were both alone. Alone. The child's mother was missing. I sat there overwhelmed, but first things first, I had to deal with the infant in my arms. Retrieving my light, I slowly stood and searched the room for a safe place to lay my screaming bundle. I settled with placing the baby on the floor and building up a pillow fort around it with throw pillows. I could feel precious seconds being wasted. As much as I had wanted to stay with the baby, the longer that Zeke was alone with the mother, the worse. With trepidation, I stood to face the hallway. Zeke must have taken her back there. I stepped forward, deciding on the door to my right first. My kick blasted the door open as my light flooded the room. It revealed a woman's bedroom that had been completely trashed. It looked like an explosion had occurred from a large hole in the center of the room. Wooden torn carpet was scattered all across the area. The flooring was bent up and outwards like something had come up through from the bottom. I leaned over the hole to see down into the muddy ground beneath. Is this how Zeke got in? It looked like the Hulk had smashed his way up through the floor. Any other time I wouldn't believe it, but sanity had left the moment that I was dispatched to this house. I knew that he could still be down there with her. If I had crawled down there, I would be putting myself in dangerously tight corridors with Zeke again. I didn't want another wrestling rematch with his freakish strength. A bolt of lightning crashed somewhere close, the bright strobe outlining a tall figure outside the bedroom window. I looked up to only catch a glimpse of it before it vanished, but it was an imposing humanoid figure of blackness with purple reflecting eyes. It must have been 10 feet tall, pressing its hands and face against the other side of the glass. As quickly as I saw it, it winked out of existence, only the after image of it in my mind. I shuffled around the hole to look out the window. Standing further out in the backyard was a group of shadows. I didn't have to wait long for another lightning strike to illuminate the night. What the light exposed hardly surprised me, but it made me shudder anyways. It was Zeke, soaking in the rain, his outstretched arm holding the mother up by the back of her neck to face me. The unnatural ease in which he held her outwards was as effortless as he had held the baby. It was as if he was presenting her to me. A twisted grin dominated his bloodied, one-eyed face as she hung limply. He beckoned me with his free hand to come before turning curtly and strolling for the woods with her. I spat a curse at him as he faded into the trees. I had to get her back. I could care less if he got away in the end, but I couldn't live with my final memory of her being taken by that grinning cyclops. He had sought her out this night. I had to stop whatever morbid plans that he had for her. I ran back into the kitchen and located the back door. I flew out into the cold rain, jumping down the slick steps and sprinting towards the woods. I could see where the foliage parted to make a small pathway. This was around the place that I had last spotted Zeke. He must have taken it. Once I hit the tree line, my momentum almost came to a stop. The water sloshed up to my knees as I took heavy steps forward. After trudging a few yards into the woods, I spotted a glimpse of movement pulling away from me. Every time that I thought that I lost Zeke's trail, I would see him slipping further into the darkness, dragging that poor woman with him. My legs burned as I forced myself forward through the deep foliage. I tried to keep Zeke in my sights through blinding trees and vines. I don't know how long I chased after him. Time did its weird thing again. I fell into a fugue state of desperation and exhaustion. All I knew is that I had to keep moving forward. Though I was surrounded by a thick forest, I felt isolated, like I was floating in the void of space, or standing at the edge of a great chasm. The darkness outside the reach of my light was a void into nothing. It seemed that only the immediate area where I stood was solid. The only things tangible around me were the figures that my light discovered. As soon as I moved past the ground that I stood on or my light passed by the surroundings, the matter returned to nothing. I could fall into the abyss and never be heard from again, another soul lost to the forest. How long would it take before people noticed that I was missing? Maybe it would be deemed important enough for a small local news report. My sheriff might call in reserves and troopers to have the woods searched for me. But after a couple of weeks it would be called off. It's too expensive to keep it up. I know because I've seen it happen a couple of times. I would just be gone. No one would really know that I had been swallowed up by despair, that I had glitched out of this reality to be forever falling into darkness. In my grim reverie of stalking after Zeke, I was vaguely aware of something shadowing me. From my peripherals, I would catch the dark figure with purple eyes keeping pace with me. I could smell the stink of BO and bad breath wafting around me. I wanted to turn my head and face the creature directly, but I was too afraid to lose track of Zeke. He was pulling further and further away from me as my body screamed to rest. Zeke disappeared through some shrubbery and I yelled in frustration as I urged myself to speed up. The corners of my vision faded and I knew that I was on the verge of passing out, on the cusp of falling into the water in exhaustion. I broke through the shrubs and entered a clearing. I looked around in wonder. A perfect circle with a 30-yard diameter. In the middle of the clearing stood an old tree stump jutting 3 feet out of the water. I could see a small sapling shooting out of the dead tree, its skinny branches reaching about 15 feet above the water. With a flash of lightning, I noticed Zeke standing next to the tree, holding the slumping woman by the collar. He had his hand reached up playing with something swinging from the tree. As I stumbled over, I could see that it was a noose. Something old for something new, Zeke proclaimed loudly, still focused on the noose. This is what my Jesus demands. The way that he said my Jesus made it clear that it wasn't the Jesus that Joel Osteen was peddling. He finally turned to face me. With an effortless and fluid motion, he hoisted the limp woman atop the stump. It's gotta be something sweet, he says. And then Zeke groaned, his one eye throwing daggers at me. Maybe it can be you, let's see what he says. But someone hangs from the tree. But I want you and the baby are just a bonus. After the massacre, I'll return to stomp the life out of the child. I had had about enough of this cryptic voodoo talk and threats. I knew that I couldn't take him hand to hand, but now he couldn't use the woman as a shield. I leveled my pistol and fired 2 quick bursts. My ears rang after the shots. The smell of gunpowder enveloped me. 2 sporadic sounds of bloop bloop as the casings hit the water. I had closed the gap between us to about 5 yards, an easy shot. So why didn't Zeke go down? Not even a flinch. I figured excitement and heart rate had made me miss. In anger, I squeezed off 5 more rounds while marching towards him. It felt like I was shooting through a shadow. He just stared at me with his cyclops eye. When I came to about 7 feet, I stopped. We stared at each other for a while, him glaring while I breathed raggedly. The only movement was the downpour around us. I knew that I was out of options. It began to dawn on me that I was going to die out here with the girl. We both were. I couldn't save her. I had chosen to chase this possessed man to the place that I would never return. A willing sacrifice. A mental picture flashed through my head. I would be laid out on the tree stump like a tribute on an altar, while the woman hung lifeless from the branch above me. Zeke smiled at me and gave a short laugh. He stretched his arms out wide as if welcoming me for a hug. And that's when I saw it. No more hiding in the corners of my vision. It revealed itself to me. A tall figure peeked out from the hangman tree behind Zeke, its purple eyes glinting. I saw it as clearly as I ever could. The inky black profile of a humanoid standing 3 feet taller than Zeke. It was made out of some unnatural blackness that had almost consumed me back in the house. My light was useless at dispersing it. It stretched out his unnaturally long hand to lay it atop Zeke's head. Zeke closed his remaining eye and began to quiver, shaking like a Holy Ghost televangelist. "No, deputy," Zeke spoke in a throaty cackle. He jerked his head from side to side, the entity never releasing its grip. Zeke gave a terrible cough and heaved his chest like he was about to throw up. It was as if his body was trying to reject the monster leeching off of him. "My Jesus has made a decision. He wants the woman. She has a sweetness most deserving defilement, a kindness to rip and tear. Her desecration will be an agony felt most by those who love her. In return, I receive his gifts, the fruits of the Spirit." Once again, I felt the world around me fall out of focus. Some dark magic was pulling me under a trance. The veil of reality thinned and the cold darkness waited for my soul to fall in. I was so tired, why fight it? I lazily put my gun back in its holster and nonchalantly dropped my light into the water. I felt the cold creep up my body like terrible claws. The unnatural cold took over my body, and I realized that I couldn't move. Or I didn't want to move. It didn't matter. I realized that the rain had stopped, turned off like a switch. I moved my eyes around in my frozen head to see millions of droplets frozen in the air. It was as if time had stopped and the rain was suspended like little planets floating against a dark galaxy. Zeke looked up and marveled at the sight. The dark entity moved out from behind the tree. My eyes were adjusted enough to the moonlight in the clearing to see the inky black mass getting closer. Panic rose within me. I didn't want the thing to get any closer to touch me. I just knew that if it touched me, it would be the most violating thing ever. But I still didn't move. I was useless to resist. The darkness was inevitable. It lowered itself in front of me, its glinter saucer eyes staring into mine. And of course, the overwhelming smell followed. It reached out a pitch-black hand to lay on top of my head. When it touched, a jolt of energy shot through me. I could feel its hate and its disgust towards me. But it wasn't just me, it was everything, even Zeke. Zeke was just a means to an end, a plaything used to spread wrath and hurt to others. But then the real event started. As I stood there dumbstruck, it showed me things. I saw the woman standing and it told me her name was Alyssa. She wore the same blank look that I had, and then realization flooded back into her face. She blinked rapidly and began to whimper. She made eye contact with Zeke, me, and the dark figure. Her eyes bulged as if pleading for escape. What followed I'm not sure of. Time was hard to measure, but it felt like an eternity. I don't know if it was real or a trance. Maybe it was a little bit of both. Both of us locked away in a crack of reality, a crack that let the darkness in to infect and corrupt. I stood motionless with tears streaming down my face as they tortured Elisa in front of me. Zeke ravaged her in countless ways with the entity hovering closely over his shoulder. Knives and cutting instruments would be handed to him out of the dark mass of the thing. They committed acts of violence that I'll never repeat, never write, but I could see that Elisa felt it all. She would scream through gritted teeth, her eyes bulging so much it seemed as if they would pop out. At the end, she would always end up hanging from the noose. In a display of sadism, she would be granted the use of her desecrated body. She would thrash around and weakly try to free herself from the rope around her neck, but she never got free. But right before she stopped struggling, the scene would reset, jump back in time. She would be completely healed and standing in the water, trapped in her own body, waiting for the ritual to begin again. I don't know how long it went on, maybe hours, maybe days, time had no meaning. As the macabre show played out on repeat again and again, I began to lose hope, just as assuredly as Elisa must have. I had given up, I had failed. I was a fool and deserved this cruel fate. I maybe even deserved worse. I deserved worse. It was this self-defeating statement that turned out to be my salvation, the lifeline to pull me out of the bottomless pit that I was sinking. But at first it was just another arrow to my heart, another stone tied to my feet. I did deserve worse, but it should be me up there. I had taken the job to help people like her. How I had failed, standing on the sidelines watching this mother be attacked on repeat. I had no kids, I was just a single and useless man. Nobody would miss me, not like her. I should take her place. This thought sparked through my mind like lightning. It was my job to stand in front of the innocent when the wolf came. Zeke spoke of sacrifice, that I should take her place. Maybe find some semblance of honor for my pathetic actions. I felt a warmth that began to grow inside of me. Zeke had cut her hundreds of times and now led her to a step on the stump so that he could put the rope around her neck. I didn't know what was happening at the time. My brain was still caught in a feverish cycle of self-hate, wanting to take her place, hating that it was her instead of me. I began to regain control of my body. I moved sluggishly towards Zeke, but he was too preoccupied. I saw the entity spin around to face me, its eyes somehow bigger. It let out a deep growl that reverberated in my brain, but it did not attack. Zeke had fastened the rope around Elisa's neck and stepped down to admire his work. Elisa let out an audible whimper as tears flooded her eyes. She knew what was coming. Maybe she prayed she would be allowed to die this time. "Jump," Zeke said, grinning through his teeth. She stepped off the stump and began to choke, her legs kicking slightly as she swung back and forth. I noticed that she didn't even attempt to remove the noose. She had given up. "No!" I screamed as I shouldered past Zeke. He reeled back in surprise. I ran up and grabbed Elisa's legs and lifted, taking the strain off of her neck. "Let me do it, it needs to be me, not her, not her!" I screamed with insane fervor. It took Elisa a moment to realize that I had finally come to her aid. I was screaming for her to take off the noose. She began squirming and pulling at the rope around her neck. I lifted her up further and stabilized her enough to remove the rope and topple us both over into the water. The cold water completely knocked my body out of its sluggish stupor, but my mind was still all haywire. I pulled Elisa out of the water and leaned her against the tree trunk. She stared back at me and began screaming as she wrapped her arms around me. She hid her face in my chest and refused to look up at the monsters. I could feel her body quivering against mine as she continued to let out muffled screams. I tried to turn to face Zeke, but Elisa held me too tight. So I just looked over my shoulder. I noticed that it was raining again and time was unfrozen. "No, take me instead," I pleaded. "She has had enough, she's done. I'm a willing sacrifice, let her sins be mine." I don't know where that last sentence came from. Divine intervention, I don't know. My mind was still in a tailspin of misery. All I know is the entity didn't like it. I heard a loud and unnatural yell. A bark, a growl maybe. The closest thing that I can compare it to is a mix between a baboon and a jaguar. It was terrifying and I knew that it came from the tall shadow. As if it was a command, Zeke started raining blows down on my head, pounding hammer fists over and over. I squeezed Elisa closer to shield her from the blows. I could take the pain, I wanted it. Zeke then tried to pull me off of her, but I held on. And that's when I realized that Zeke had lost his strength. His blows hurt, but they were the blows of a normal man. He couldn't even pull me away from Elise. A small beacon of hope bloomed in my soul. Zeke was tiring. Zeke began cursing me. Hopefully he was reading my mind as I thought the most heinous things about him. And then he reached for my gun on my hip. I have a level 3 retention holster, meaning that you have to press a button, push it down, and rock it forward to release it from the holster. It takes practice, but Zeke manipulated it smoothly and pulled it away from me. I half turned to face Zeke, still shielding her away from him. Zeke huffed and pointed my gun at me with a shaky hand. "You would die for her, you pig," he screamed at me. "Yeah, you backwoods inbred," I spat in defiance. I had already accepted my fate. If I was to die, at least let it mean that Elisa would survive. One honorable thing during a life of failure. "I'll kill you and then I'll kill your girl anyways," Zeke shrieked. I closed my eyes and waited for the hot bullets to pierce my body. What does being shot feel like? Will they make it quick and go for the head? Closed casket for sure. But the shots never came. 10 seconds felt like 10 hours before I opened my eyes. I cradled Elisa's drenched and shaking body tightly. I tried to meet the creature's piercing stare, but it was too much. It projected so much anger into my heart. I knew this was the end. At least Zeke wouldn't get the satisfaction. But I didn't know what untold horrors the creature would perform on me. Maybe I would be taken away like Zeke, locked away within this unholy creature. "Just leave her," I said. The entity just stared back silently, the rain wiping around it. And then I heard a deep rumbling coming from it. Was it laughter? It was. A wicked sound. It began to back away from me as the deep chuckle continued. The thing made it to the edge of the tree line and all I could see was its reflecting eyes floating in the storm. And just like that, it disappeared. It was over. It took a minute for it to register with my rattled mind, but I knew in my heart that it had left. The fog over my soul had lifted. I sat Elise on the stump and stared up into the sky. The rain felt refreshing instead of drowning. I won't bore you with the after-action report of the mountain of paperwork that followed, but I fished my gun out of the water and I silently helped Elisa limp back to her house. Not a word said between us. I mean, what was there to say? Oh, and the backup still hadn't arrived yet. The baby was fine, if not a little bruised, and the EMT took Elisa to the hospital. She had returned to a semi-catatonic state, not saying anything for about a week. She finally did start talking again, but she claimed that she didn't remember anything. I consider it a mercy. She and her child went to live with her parents. They told me that she had extreme night terrors every night, but quickly forgot them upon waking. Hopefully, she can have a normal life for her child, but she will never be the same. Evil had left its stain on her. I kept my report short and sweet. I wisely chose to omit the shadow monster and the dimension of torture that Elisa was in. I left out the part about emptying 7 rounds into an unkillable demon-powered man. I just told the narrative of chasing Zeke out of the house and into the woods where I rescued Elisa. Oh, and Zeke may have an injury to his eye. It was too dark to tell how bad that I had hurt him. That same night, Zeke's brother had died. It was in the papers the next day. He was locked up in the neighboring county. He had suffered a heart attack in his cell. There was a whole investigation. The video showed him banging on the door and crying for help. But there was a big fight in another part of the jail, so nobody heard or paid attention to his cries as he died alone. I stayed with the department for another month. They put a warrant out for Zeke for burglary and assaulting a police officer, but I never expected him to turn up. Until one day he did. My sergeant had come into the office with a big smile on his face. He let me know that they had found my guy. He said that Zeke was found on some hunting lease in a neighboring county. Sarge slapped down a folder with pictures in it. I opened it to see a familiar sight. A clearing with a tree stump in the middle. Another younger tree growing out of the middle of it. And there hung the body of Zeke dangling from the noose. His body was bloated and rotten. I turned the page to see a picture with a closer look. He wore the ratty black raincoat and his left eye was missing. "What happened?" I asked incredulously. Well, some hunter found old Zeke about a week ago. Guess he got tired of running and he offed himself. My sergeant spoke matter-of-factly. The strange thing is, the coroner said that he had been up there for months. Kinda messes up your timetable of events. I don't know, maybe the doc is a quack. The summer heat does speed up decomp. He was at least up there long enough for the birds to get at his eyes. I felt sick. I had a strange feeling that the Zeke I had encountered had somehow been hanging from the tree at the same time. Some sort of cruel trick played out by the power of the purple-eyed shadow. I don't know how I knew this, it was like I had always known. Before my sergeant walked into his office, he turned to face me. Can you believe that bullets were found in him? Post-mortem, they say. But people must have hated him enough to do some target practice instead of reporting him. I left the department shortly after that. See, I had been changed too, like Elise. Driving alone at night, I would be terrified of the shadows moving in my peripherals, hoping that I wouldn't catch a glint of purple. I knew that thing was still out there waiting for me on every call that I went to. I could turn any corner to see it looming there, staring at me with its hate-filled eyes. I don't know what stopped him from taking me that night, or why he stilled Zeke's hand from pulling the trigger. Maybe it was my willingness to sacrifice myself, something pure in the midst of evil. I hope it was. Rather it be Harry Potter logic or Sunday school logic, I don't care. No greater love, right? But then there's the darker thought, the one that keeps me up at night. I volunteered I had made a deal. Maybe the thing decided to honor my deal over Zeke's. Maybe I owe a debt that hasn't been paid yet. The entity is just waiting, hoping that I'll forget before he comes for me, pushing me into the void like he did Zeke. I work at another police department now. I took a step back to work in dispatch, but the call of the wild still affects me. I want to get back in a black and white and be in the field. I know that I can't live in fear. I have to reclaim my life. A test for a patrol position is coming up and I've already signed up. But there is part of me that I suppress every day just to keep moving. It lingers in the recesses of my mind. I just know it for some reason, like I do other dark things now. Whether on my deathbed at 90 or answering another disturbance call tomorrow, I'll see it again. It's inevitable. It knows me now. It has marked me. The purple eyes filled with hate. Zeke's Jesus. I want the job, I said. It was 2 years ago and I could vividly recall every aspect of that interview. The innocence of those 4 words, the stillness of the gallery, my befuddled reaction to Amy Andrews, the gallery owner whose questions had unsettled me. Her composure never waned. "Are you a spiritual man, Mr. Hall?" Miss Andrews asked. "Yes," I answered. "Are we talking about the art?" I can't say that I'd be able to give philosophical or religious insights. "Oh, don't worry," Miss Andrews replied, smiling. "I'm not trying to trip you up. In a way, my question does relate to the paintings, but perhaps not in the way that you might expect. I was a police officer for many years before working as a security guard at the embassy," I said. I had plenty of references. The gallery owner raised a hand, smiling politely. "Oh, I've seen your CV. I promise that you don't have to fight your corner, Mr. Hall. I know you're physically capable, but this job takes a toll on a mental level." I nodded my head, ignorantly believing that I understood her. "I know, I've worked many solo night shifts at the embassy, but I can handle it." "Well, that's not what I mean," she replied. "Do you know why my gallery exhibits a permanent display of my sister's artwork?" "To honor her memory," I said. "I saw that news clip a couple of years ago about her admittance to the local psychiatric ward. Harper Andrews, right? I'm sorry, that must have been tough on your family." "Not as tough as Harper found it. Miss Andrews replied. Her artwork tells the story of her decline into sickness. Not sickness of the mind, but sickness of the soul. She faced something and captured it in these paintings to protect humanity. Hearing her speak, I thought Amy seemed just as unwell as her sister, but I would soon learn that it was no delusion. Every night on the job was terrifying, but none so much as the first. And I'll never forget Miss Andrews' parting words as she walked out of the door. At night, the paintings must be closely guarded. Left unobserved for too long, they can, well, just make sure you keep watch. What is this, a night at the museum? I mused, trying not to chuckle. Oh no, far worse than fiction. The first hour of my shift was blissfully mundane. Basking in the blue glow of the gallery's security lighting, a perturbing painting eyeballed me from the far wall. It depicted a lanky, pencil-thin man with frightfully long legs and a pair of white eyes which seemed to follow me around the room, as all freakish eyes in paintings do. As I strolled around the gallery, following Miss Andrews' strict rule of observing the paintings often, I took a closer look at the white-eyed man. I shivered at his janky jaw, which hung abnormally loosely. He wore jet black trousers, but his monstrous bony torso was shirtless, and he was the farthest a man could be from looking human. I stopped to read the plaque beneath the painting of the haunting figure. The exactor, the one who exacts torture. He longs to break free. He will devour mankind. I hurried past the painting, reasonably certain that nobody would ever dream of stealing artwork so horrifying, and no need to guard it too closely. But the gallery didn't exactly become more joyous as I continued my round. They were petrifying. I should have given the paintings more than a cursory glance before applying for the job position. Another painting portrayed a young girl, no more than 10 years of age, who wore a bright red pinafore, plaited brunette hair, and a blank face. Not figuratively, blank. In place of eyes and nose and a mouth, there was only skin. Taut flesh painted with smooth brushstrokes that made Harper's intentions abundantly clear. The artist had not accidentally smudged the face. She had purposefully neglected to give the little girl any features. Harper's youth dies. As we age, we slowly come to life. We sin, they know that, they know everything. There were countless paintings of dreadful scenes too. Cities in ruin, the end of the world. Endless infernos of melting flesh. And they were the lucky ones who were offered a swift mercy. The survivors in the apocalyptic paintings were tortured in gruesome ways by dreadful inhuman men like the one in the first painting. I usually have a strong stomach, but something about those paintings filled me with unbearable dread. The apocalyptic art seemed so visceral. As I viewed it, I was certain that I heard the screams of the last humans on Earth, felt the heat of the flames on my skin, saw the exactors move. And then there was a painting of the art gallery. The plaque read, "Prison. They entered our world, so I locked them here." Feeling suitably terrified, I scurried to the sofa by the gallery's entrance and plopped myself down. I work a day job, and the night shift is just my way of making ends meet. The exhaustion of that jam-packed day finally hit me. It was only when I sat down on the sofa that fatigue walloped me like a wall. My eyelids closed. An hour later, a thrumming sound startled me awake. I twisted my head to see a notification on my phone, chuckling in relief. I opened the message from Kara, my wife, welcoming the distraction from my isolated, soundless night shift. But it was an odd message. "I was telling my mom about your new job, and she said that you should look for another one. Apparently there's always adverts for the night shift on Facebook, and her friend's husband had a mental breakdown after one shift. He won't talk to anyone about what happened. There was another thrumming sound, but it wasn't a vibration from my phone. It was a muffled voice. My head snapped up in time to catch a silhouette vanishing behind one of the gallery walls. I managed to stifle a scream, but I lost my composure and clammed up. I contemplated running out of the gallery, but something stopped me, and it wasn't the prospect of being fired. It was those paintings of Armageddon. I rose to my feet using the flashlight on my phone to illuminate the dimly lit gallery floor. That muffled sound repeated again, haunting me. A ghostly groan of some emotion that I couldn't quite place, but I knew it terrified me. And when I rounded the corner, I found myself facing something utterly inexplicable. The girl from Harper's youth dies. A young version of Harper, I could only assume. I trembled on the spot as she took clunky steps towards me with her frail and near-skeletal legs. She continued to groan, seemingly speaking beneath the flesh that covered her entire face. "I can't understand you," I whispered in horror as the ghastly girl stopped a foot in front of me. I found myself leaning forwards, driven by a force beyond my control. And then the most horrifying thing happened. My cheek twisted to the side, allowing my ear to melt through the phantom pool of the girl's face. I screamed silently, terrified to find that I was unable to move my body or utter a sound. Then, with my ear beneath the flesh on Harper's horrendous and featureless face, I could finally hear the words that she had been repeating in a muffled and ghoulish voice. "Why did you close your eyes?" The malformed ghost asked in a distorted cry. My body was suddenly hurled to the floor and the little girl fled into the shadows. My eyes shot to the far wall and I found that my gut had achieved the impossible. It sank to a deeper realm of fear. He was gone. The exactor was a blank canvas. The horrible entity had escaped its painting. Harper's disembodied voice whispered beside my ear, scaring the life out of me. "Find him. He's hiding." I looked up at the ghostly girl's painting. Harper had returned to the canvas, but she was adopting a different pose. Her index finger was pointing at the painting of the art gallery. I yelped in fright, seeing what she had noticed. Behind one of the painted windows on the empty top floor of the building, that inhuman man stood and watched me. Legs shaking, I walked across the gallery to the set of stairs in the back corner. They led to an out-of-bounds floor. Miss Andrews made that abundantly clear. But she also made it clear that I had to keep my eyes on the artwork, and I failed at that. I didn't really have any options. Quivering, I crept up the creaky wooden stairs to a floor that was littered with unhung paintings. The frames were shrouded in white sheets, and at the far end of the room, illuminated only by the moonlight which poured through the murky glass panes, I saw something truly terrifying. The exactor. He stood as tall as the ceiling and his large form was crouching over an uncovered painting. As I crept closer, I saw what had captivated the terrible creature. It was one of Harper's apocalyptic paintings, depicting a world in flames, and the exactor was melding its shriveled, unclothed arm with the canvas, much as young Harper sank my ear through her flesh. However, as I approached the abomination, casting my flashlight upon him, its flesh had started to sizzle, and it unleashed a hideous hissing sound. At first, I thought that the light had hurt it, but then I realized it had become aware of the guards' watchful eyes upon it. I finally realized the power of keeping watch. I knew why I was there. "Cast it away," Harper's voice whispered. "How?" I cried. The man spun around and I screamed at the sight of his wretched white eyes. They were worse in the flesh and he was far larger than he had appeared in the painting. The entity lunged at me, coiling its bony hands around my neck, squeezing the light out of my soul. I slipped into the darkness and the exactor howled at me, a howl that sounded like a boat's horn. "Tell it to return to its cell," Harper croaked. "Tell it that you won't stop looking at it until it does what you say." I wheezed, watching flickering images in the exactor's blank eyes, prophecies of a direful destruction, a fiery vision of mankind's end at the hands of this terrifying apparition and its demonic army. He intended to scare me, but the thought of such a horrific future only motivated me to keep my eyes open. "I won't stop," I said, slowly choking, "until you stop." Inhuman flesh burning beneath the weight of my vision, the exactor screeched in fury, but I thought the world might already be doomed. If I had passed out, I would have left the demon unguarded and free to wreak havoc upon mankind. But in some favorable twist of fate, it released my neck, and I fell to the ground, and it too must have been close to death. I crawled downstairs, and the canvases were filled with paint once more. Everything was back in its place, and the strangest thing is that I didn't hang up my hat. I didn't call it a day. When Miss Andrews came to the gallery at 6 in the morning, she seemed fully prepared to watch another traumatized guard quit the job. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not after seeing the exactor's apocalyptic desire. Too much is at stake. For those of you who missed the first post, my night shifts as an art gallery's security guard are more horrifying than anything a person should endure. My job isn't to protect the paintings, it's to protect humanity from the paintings. Each canvas is a paranormal cell. The artist, Harper Andrews, even contained a terrifying interpretation of her younger self in a portrait as a safeguard. The faceless child isn't even the worst thing in there. There are paintings of mankind's doom, hellfire, Armageddon. And then there's the painting of the exactor, an inhuman man tall as a tree, with woefully white eyes and a limp jaw. He and his malformed minions are imprisoned in the gallery's exhibits, and they seek freedom. They long to eternally torture mankind in unimaginable ways. They plot a fate worse than death. I've spoken about my first shift, but I'm sure you didn't think that I had gone 2 years without another incident. One particular evening about 4 months ago, a text conversation with my wife took a horrifying turn. "You can quit the day job, surely. You're making plenty of money from the gallery. You just want to spend more time with me. Oh, you love me. While it is a little suspicious that you spend so much time away from home, have you got another woman on the side? Amy's hot in a squint your eyes kind of way. There's a higher chance of me hooking up with one of Harper's demons. Ooh, that reminds me. I just bought one of the paintings I couldn't resist. Crap, I should have told my wife about my work. I should have told her about the terrible nature of the things that I guard. She never would have bought the artwork if she had known it were more than paint on a canvas. After reading her message, I hurriedly rang her. "Oh, please tell me you were joking," I said, shaking. "Are you okay, Frank? You sound weird," Kara replied. "Why did you have to buy one of those paintings?" I asked. "What? Oh, I know you like macabre things," she chortled. "Don't be a baby, you stare at those paintings all night. What's so wrong with having one of them in our living room?" I don't understand why Amy would sell their sister's work," I said. "Oh, I pulled her aside for a chat after you showed me around the gallery. Honestly, I can't believe it took you over a year to give me a tour. Such beautiful paintings. Disturbing but beautiful. Harper Andrews is incredibly talented. But what happened to her is sad." Kara sighed. "You just made an offer that Amy accepted?" I asked. "She claimed to have little attachment to it. She said it isn't one of the paintings that demands eyes upon it. Seemed a rude comment because I think it's as great as the rest of her sister's art, but..." Kara began. "I have to go," I interrupted, hanging up the phone. It was an hour or so before my night shift, but I arrived early. Amy Andrews was engrossed in conversation with the last few gallery visitors of the day, but I quickly dragged her away from the crowd. Fury frothed to the surface of my lips. "Why did you sell one of the paintings to Kara?" I asked. Miss Andrews answered in an eerily flat tone. I come from a wealthy family, Mr. Hall, but I'm not that wealthy. I have limited income streams and I have to keep the gallery's lights on. Sure, I make money from memberships and fundraising events, but I try to sell paintings too. But Harper, you know they need to be watched at all times, I protested. Oh, not all of them, she said. And that was when I realized which painting was missing from the gallery. There was an empty spot on the wall above the plaque that read, Harper's Youth Dies. What have you done? My sister's demented self-portrait might be horrifying, Mr. Hall, but it doesn't intend to harm us. It's not one that needs to be watched. And your wife paid handsomely for it, Miss Andrews explained, shrugging. I gripped my employer's arm in a moment of madness that could have cost my job and, for all I knew, the future of mankind. On that first night, young Harper was the entity that kept watch over me. I hissed furiously. Your sister painted herself for a reason. Everything in this gallery has a purpose. Don't you understand that? For a flicker of a moment, I was certain that something flashed in Amy Andrews' eyes. Something black, and the corner of her lips twitched as if to reveal that she were well aware of what she had done. But her mouth quickly returned to its normal position. I pay you to watch over the exhibits. You shouldn't need anyone or anything to watch over you. Screw this, I spat. I'm going home and I'm bringing that painting back with me. Miss Andrews huffed, glancing at her watch. 55 minutes until your shift begins. I would hurry. I drove home, mind racing with the horror of Miss Andrews' crooked grin. Did she intentionally sell the painting to sabotage the gallery? Don't be foolish. If she were that evil, she could have just left the paintings unwatched, freeing the exactor into the world. I tried to still my throbbing heartbeat as I pulled onto our street. After hurriedly parking, I didn't even close the car door behind me. I raced into our darkened home and started screaming at the top of my lungs. Kara, where are you? In the living room, she shouted. Why are we yelling? I rushed into the room and my chest loosened a bit. There was no sign of destruction, just my wife sitting on the sofa in a well-lit room. Harper's Youth Dies hung on the wall, but the girl's ghastly form remained in its canvas. Oh, thank God, I exhaled. What is your deal with this creepy little girl? Kara asked, laughing. I have to take it back, Kara. I'll make sure that Miss Andrews gives us a refund. My wife rose to her feet and walked over to the painting, stroking Harper's featureless face. I shuddered in terror, waiting for the ghoul to leap free from its frame. I assumed that she wouldn't hurt us, but I wasn't certain of anything. Oh, come and give her a stroke, my wife teased. She doesn't bite. I looked at my phone. I had a half hour until the start of my shift. Miss Andrews had made it clear what would happen if I weren't on time. I feared that she might do something worse than fire me. She might leave the paintings unattended. I'll get you a better painting, I said. Something creepy from another gallery. Just anything other than a Harper Andrews piece. Please. Oh, would it make you happier if I were to draw a smiley face on her? Kara asked. My wife dipped her finger into her glass of water, and I cried in agony as she drew a crude pair of dots and a pencil-thin smile on Harper's featureless face. Kara frowned at my gaping maw when she finished. Hey, relax, we own it, she said. And besides, it'll dry, don't worry. I walked over to her and seized her hands tightly, taking a deep breath. Kara, I said gently, I'm begging you. She frowned. Oh, I know that look, Frank. You're actually scared. Why? Just tell me and I'll let you take the painting back. You saw a ghost when you were young, didn't you? I asked. Kara nodded. My dad, shortly after the car crash. Hard to believe it, but I did. Well, I know you believe. You said that you once saw your grandma's ghost, didn't you? I gripped her hands tightly and nodded. Right, so we believe in spirituality. While this painting, I mean all of Harper's paintings, are gateways to to something unearthly, and that is why I guard them. I'm sorry that it took me so long to tell you." My wife hung her head and shook it. "You talk in your sleep, you know. You've been having nightmares for months, talking about an entity and the end of the world. I knew there was something wrong with you. The light suddenly cut out and a wisp of wind like a hissing voice filled the room. Kara shrieked and leapt into my arms. I shuddered, keeping her close to my chest so that she couldn't see what I saw. Harper's youth dies. The watery marks on Harper's featureless face glowed faintly in the darkness, a dim white light. And the most terrifying part was that the droplets which formed the smile had inexplicably transformed into a sulk. "May I take it?" I asked Kara in a whisper. She nodded, face burrowed deeply into my chest, and so I guided her to the bedroom and instructed her to shut the door. I checked my phone. 20 minutes until my shift. I seized the painting from the wall, sprinted out of the house, and lunged into my car. When I arrived at the art gallery, the lights were off and Amy's car was nowhere in sight. Fortunately, I was on time for my shift, but I had no way of knowing how long she had left the place unattended. I hurried inside and immediately hung "Harper's Youth Dies" above its plaque. The gallery was full again. I looked at the painting of the exactor. I was relieved to see that the monstrosity was still encaged, but something still felt wrong. There was a churning chasm in my gut. "You're not in the art gallery," Harper's entity whispered in a distorted voice. I finally saw what she meant. The colors of my surroundings had started to swirl. The gallery walls, the floor, the paintings, and even my hands looked murky. The world was composed of paint. I was composed of paint. And when I looked into the street, I saw the towering edges of a painting's frame. I was trapped in prison. Harper's depiction of the art gallery, which you may remember from my first post. And I knew that I was trapped in the painting because I could see the real world beyond the canvas. My memories flooded back. When I had entered the real art gallery, the exactor had tricked me. He stood in his painting and everything seemed fine. I looked into those horrible white eyes, and that's when its mouth tore open to swallow me. I screeched into the nothingness. Never had I felt such a nightmarish horror before, not even on my first night in the gallery. I felt dead, worse than dead. I thought that I had entered hell itself. I thought that I had failed at my job and the rapture had commenced. I thought of so many sickening possibilities as the exactor's blackened void had engulfed me. Squirming inside his darkened body, I was carried by the inhuman man across the gallery floor, and he aggressively spat me into the canvas of prison. I had forgotten that. He made me forget that I had left the real world.
"It's looking for an exit,"
Harper's voice croaked. "Me too," I cried. I looked at Harper's painting and she wasn't there. In her place, there was a doorway with a flickering green exit sign above it. I felt the brushstrokes of that painted world stretch and strain. The canvas was crushing me and I didn't belong there. My painted form had tightened, and I rushed to the doorway that Harper had created, terrified of what might happen if I were to stay in that false world for a moment longer. As my hand met the painted canvas within the painted canvas, my body liquefied and merged with the exit on the canvas. A blackness still and serene enveloped me, and then I found myself lying on a tiled floor, a real tiled floor, choking. Back in reality, I gazed across the gallery and my eyes met a terrible sight. The contents of every painting had spilled onto the floor. The exactor stood proudly amidst his minions, plotting in a sharp whisper. I had expected a cacophonous roar of noise from the apocalyptic demons, but something about the near silence of their scheming was even more frightening. Still in the distance, I could hear human screams again, the apocalyptic sound of mankind being tortured in an endless oblivion. The agonizing cries were almost tuneful, in a terribly dissonant way. Choral screaming, humanity's horrifying final song. Suddenly, in unearthly unison, the exactor's minions, smaller versions of him but no less terrifying, snapped their heads backwards to face me, as if the brittle bones in their necks had jellied. I screamed at their upside-down faces which hung over their unclothed backs. They were wide-eyed and slack-jawed, eyeing me from the middle of the room. They wheezed as their skin sizzled beneath the weight of my eyes upon them. "Back to your paintings," I feebly shrieked. There was nothing commanding about my tone. Pure terror drove me, and the exactor could see that. His eyes pierced mine as they had on that first night. In them I saw nothing, the absence of anything. And by that, I mean the end of everything, the end of man and the end of ends. He tried to fill me with dread beyond imagination, and he succeeded. But it was the same fateful error that he had made on that first night. I thought of Kara, my parents, my friends, everyone that I love. That was what motivated me while my eyes watered under the strain of looking at those horrid things. Ghoulish voices chittered that I must either close my eyelids or die. I didn't fall for the entity's egregious schemes. I clenched my fists, armed only with my eyes and sheer willpower. The minions retreated first. Flesh burning, they scurried backwards, dragging their upside-down heads and misshapen limbs with them, back into the flames of their painted paradise. And it'll always be a dream, I told myself. But the exactor remained, mouth gaping so wide that it dropped past his shoulders. His flesh scorched. Wisps of smoke billowed from his shirtless torso and raggedy trousers. In one final fit of rage, he took powerful strides towards me and outstretched one of his slender arms. I caught his wrist before those gnarled, ghastly fingers could wrap around my neck, and the pain was unexplainable. It was a deep burning of the mind, not the body. The exactor's last-ditch attempt to incapacitate the guard who was standing between it and the apocalypse. I saw Kara. She was sitting in our living room smiling at something on the wall. I could only watch in unbridled horror as her flesh melted before my very eyes. Horrifyingly, she continued to smile even when she had been reduced to smoldering, bloody meat on the sofa. The exactor showed me what she saw. On the wall there hung a painting of her house burning to the ground in the midst of mankind's total annihilation. On the streets, the exactor's minions inflicted unspeakable horrors upon humanity. A demon gutted a woman with the protruding bone from her own severed limb. That's the only scene that I can put into writing. The rest are too dreadful. Wait a minute, it's not real, it's another trick. Kara wouldn't smile at such a thing. My eyes ached under the immense strain of watching that unholy apparition. But the exactor caved first. Unable to bear my eyes upon it, it wriggled free from my grip, taking what appeared to be excruciating steps back to its canvas. And when it returned to its frame, the choral screaming ceased. The gallery was still and silent. I spent the rest of my shift standing in that exact spot, eyeballing the paintings before me. I didn't speak and I didn't move. Before I left the building at the end of my shift, I quickly glanced back at prison, the painting that had trapped me. Dread gripped my heart, and 4 months later it still hasn't released me. I can't stop thinking about how it felt to be within that canvas. How will I ever know that I'm in the real world? What if the apocalypse has already happened? I might be living in a painting right now. Well, there you go. Another direful tale from the art gallery. Another near miss. Just part and parcel of the job, huh? Since my first shift, nothing has been the same. Every passing day feels worse than the last. The impending apocalypse cast a long shadow over my life. I explained everything to Kara, and she knows why I can't quit. And now you know that I worry about something other than the exactor. Amy Andrews. Something's wrong with her. Perhaps I should speak to the one person who could actually give me some answers. I think I need to visit the local psych ward. Harper Andrews, the woman who could provide answers to all my questions. Yesterday afternoon, I visited her at the local psychiatric ward. "I know why you're here," Harper said. The woman was slender and she wore pristine white attire. Her brunette hair was glistening in the midday sun. It hung in prim and proper plaits which made me shudder. She was the spitting image of her painting. Harper's youth dies. That was unnerving given that she was a couple of decades older than the version of herself that she had painted. "The paintings," I eventually replied. Harper smiled, motioning at the seat opposite her in the deserted canteen. I nodded awkwardly and slumped into the stiff plastic chair on the other side of the table. A member of staff loitered in the canteen doorway, keeping a watchful eye over us. "And 2 years on the job, right?" Harper asked. "I think you would have summoned the courage to visit me a long time ago, if this were only about the exactor." I shivered at the very mention of the name, and I quickly glanced at the member of staff, just to ensure that he only stood 6 feet tall. For a fleeting moment, I thought the nightmarish man from the painting had been hunching in the doorway and watching me. "I'm not blaming you," Harper continued. "I just want to save time. My sister isn't evil. In fact, she's a kind-hearted woman, and maybe part of her is still in there, but it's not the part that's in control. She longs to free the exactor and the others." I paused for a long time, staring into the dejected eyes of the woman before me. She looked sharp, focused, well, not at all what I had expected. Why haven't you with Amy?" I trailed off. Harper sighed, reading my mind. "Yeah, I suppose killing her would have brought an end to things, wouldn't it? Yet somewhere deep down, she's still my sister. I'm sorry, and why, you might wonder, hasn't she already freed the creatures from their painted prisons?" "Now that final question is the one that really needs to be answered, I think," I said. Harper nodded. "Do you have your phone with you?" "Yeah, why?" "Record my story," she said. "I need you to document the knowledge that I'm about to pass on to you. Nobody has ever believed me, but you will. You've seen what's at stake." The year was 2003 and I was 8 years old and Amy was in her 20s. My birth certainly caused an upheaval. Mom was a full-time lawyer and Dad was a historian. They thought their days of parenting were long behind them. "Mom, did I ruin Dad's life?" I once asked. "Oh, you were the best curveball that life threw at us, darling," my mom promised, and we chuckled. And Dad loved us, but he spent so much time abroad. He wasn't quite so busy or successful in his youth, so I think that he worried that he had been a better father to Amy. One fateful day, he sought to rectify that. "Machu Picchu," he said. "Let's go, you and me." "What's in Pikachu?" I asked. My dad laughed. "Machu Picchu, it's a lost city. I think you'll love it. You could paint it. Your talents are wasted on the dull scenery around here." I didn't think that I would enjoy ancient ruins, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to spend time with Dad, and he seemed so excited about the place. It was stunning. My 8-year-old brain wasn't immature enough to overlook that. And after hours of watching my father excavate what he called a point of interest, the man finally started to dance jubilantly. I stopped painting to see what enthralled him. The fruit of his labor was a large slab of stone, and it was covered with dreadful etchings of ghastly creatures. My dad started jabbering ecstatically about the magnitude of what he had uncovered. He spent a decade connecting dots between the mysterious vanishings of advanced cultures. They were indicators of a destructive force, a plague greater than anything earthly. He said there were entities which sought to destroy humanity, though their origin remained a mystery. They certainly weren't bound by physical laws. and my father uncovered detailed writings on rituals which successfully contain the abominations. He said salvation always came from imprisoning the entities, but they couldn't be killed and they would always seek freedom. That was what terrified me. They would always seek freedom, and my father held their prison in his very hands. He had unearthed something which should have been left alone. When we returned to England, I slipped into my father's study and found his translated text. I had a terrible feeling about the stone slab that he had brought home, and so I studied the ritual that could imprison the entities. It involved detailed drawings and a watcher. But who was watching the drawings while they were buried beneath the earth in Machu Picchu? Well, nobody. My father's research seemed to suggest that the Inca artist in Machu Picchu had uncovered a new ritual, something which allowed the Incas to trap the demons more successfully than their predecessors. If my father had only let it be, you would still be living a normal life, Frank Hull. None of us would be in this mess. But things quickly took a dark turn. My parents started bickering about that stone slab. Dad would obsessively stare at it until the early hours of the morning. He said that it spoke to him. When my mother couldn't take it anymore, she left. Amy and I were distraught and we hated our father. And that was when my sister did something stupid. She destroyed the stone slab with a sledgehammer. Everything quickly fell apart. The exactor and his deformed creatures steadily rose from the shattered stone, and I fled the room. It was the moment that I had dreaded, the prophecy which had riddled me with nightmares. I locked myself in my room and unboxed the paintings that I had completed in preparation weeks ago. And to imprison the freed demons in a new picture, however, a ritual was required. As many artists had done before me, I dislodged one of my teeth. Bloody gummed and teary from the agony, I started to shakily etch my name into each of the paintings with my baby tooth, and the most horrifying thing happened. One by one, black masses started to slither under my door. The creatures were unwillingly latching into their painted forms. They were being trapped in a fresh prison. The house felt unnaturally still. I crept out of my bedroom and called for my family. When I entered the living room, I shuddered. The demons were gone, but my dad was sitting in his rocking chair. His eyes were vacant and he was smiling. It was a wicked grin, something beyond your darkest imagination. Blood oozed through finger tears in the fabric of his shirt. He had been clawing at his own flesh. He was still alive, but he didn't move a muscle or utter a word. He just grinned. Amy, meanwhile, was curled on the sofa in a fetal position. She was bawling her eyes out, and when the police arrived, they discovered something disturbing. Mom never left. Her body was found in the garden shed, and she had been decomposing for weeks. I never saw the scene, but I vividly remember one of the paramedics throwing up on the grass. Our father went to prison and Amy became my guardian. I explained everything to her, but she didn't believe me. And so I kept a daily watch over the paintings, and years later, I used my inheritance money to open an art gallery. I thought that it would lessen the burden if other eyes were on the paintings. Amy helped me run the place, and she had her hands in lots of different money pots, so she didn't mind that the gallery was a bit of a money burner. However, one day she changed. She came home from the gallery with a vacant look in her eyes, a look that reminded me of Dad. She told me that she finally believed my story. She saw the exactor step out of its painting. I couldn't always be at the gallery, but Amy promised that she would never leave the paintings unattended. She admitted that she had gone out to grab some food before locking up for the evening. If she hadn't returned in time, I suppose that you and I wouldn't be having this conversation right now. The world would have already ended. Anyway, my sister changed over the following years. She grew cold and distant, and I started to see a darkness in her eyes, and she spoke in a voice that wasn't hers. I became so fearful of her and her malevolent smile that I had a nervous breakdown, And that was her ticket. Well, the exactor's ticket. She had me committed to this ward 4 years ago. I suppose that the exactor thought that without me in the way, she could puppeteer Amy to free him from the painting. All she had to do was make sure that nobody looked at him. But why haven't things already fallen apart? Why did she hire guards to keep watch? Well, she still plays by my rules because I have something that the exactor needs. If it had so wished, that terrifying creature would have driven my sister to kill me, much as it drove my father to kill my mother. But it needs the tooth that I used in the ritual. The exactor always uses slaves to achieve that goal. It seeps into people's minds. At its behest, I'm certain my dad must have destroyed whatever Incan tool was used to etch the drawings on the stone slab. So even if Amy were to close her eyes or better yet destroy the paintings, it still wouldn't be enough to free the entities. It sounds like watching them might be unnecessary then, huh? As long as I keep the tooth hidden, you can just quit your security role and call it a day. No way that the exactor can fulfill its destiny, right? The problem is that an unwatched exactor, while unable to end the world, becomes freer and freer with every passing moment. Free enough to find me without Amy's help, perhaps, and infiltrate my mind to find the tooth's location. As long as somebody keeps watch, they remain in their paintings. Their real power lies in servants, my dad and now Amy. She visits me often and she only wants one thing from me, the tooth, but I still hold the power. She does what I say, otherwise I've threatened to end things. The secret dies with me. The exactor uses her to wear me down, but I'm stronger than it thinks. And that's everything, Frankel. The rest is a mystery even to me. I stopped recording at that point and I exhaled deeply. There was so much information to digest. Have you seen the length of that transcript? Sorry to anyone who didn't prepare themselves for such a gargantuan body of text. Amy's trying to sabotage things, I explained. She let Harper's youth dyes out of the gallery. Harper sighed. Well, it might be time for me to. No, I didn't mean that, I firmly said. Harper's eyes were brimming with tears. I'm tired, Frank, I'm so tired, I'm only one person. Well, you're not alone, I said. I'll keep watch. She sniffled. And what happens when you reach your breaking point? Maybe this is bigger than us, maybe we need to tell someone. I scoffed. Like who, the government? You think that would be a good idea? Give the exactor hundreds of minds to infiltrate. It's dangerous enough that your paintings are visible to the public. You and I won't live forever to fight the good fight, Harper pointed out. Well, then we'll keep looking for people to take up the mantle. Or maybe we'll eventually figure out what that Incan artist did to truly seal the lid on these monstrosities, I said. He found a way to put them in the bin for good. No watcher needed. Harper sighed. Well, I guess there's one more thing that you should know. What's that? Well, the tooth, she said. It's in the house. Whoa, stop, I barked. What are you doing? The secret dies with you, remember? Yeah, but Amy's never going to stop looking for it. So you need to keep her away from the base. Harper began. Please, I cried. I don't know why you're telling me this, I have a bad feeling. I looked up to find that the member of staff had left, and that was when the clamp tightened on my gut. The sun seemed to dim and an emptiness filled the room. I know that sounds like a contradiction, but I'm sure Harper felt it too. Her eyes widened. Frank, is there a red Range Rover in the parking lot? Legs trembling, I crept over to the canteen window and squinted. A graying cloud hovered heavily above. Blue sky lay beyond the solitary omen. There seemed to be no other visitors beside my white Mitsubishi. There was only a crimson Range Rover. I shrieked in horror. Frank, Harper began. You need to. A splintering sound echoed around the canteen and I spun around to see something sickeningly sinister. Harper's neck had been snapped backwards and her upside-down head hung over the back of her chair, much like those menacing exactors in the art gallery so many months ago. In the doorway of the canteen, there stood a figure too tall for the frame. I screamed, squinting my eyes, but it was Amy. She seemed to be a regular height, but I know what I saw for a fleeting second. I chased her out of the building, heart racing as I prepared to meet a similar fate. But the exactor spared me, it had other plans. Besides, Amy was nimble. I was no threat. She had driven away before I could even reach her. That was 3 hours ago. I know where she's going. The good news is that their family house is in Ireland, so it'll take some time for Amy to get there. The bad news is that it'll take some time for me to get there too. I'm currently waiting for a flight. Tomorrow, the world might end. Cherish your loved ones. I arrived in Ireland after a short flight, but it was too late. The dilapidated house harbored secrets, and though I was armed with Harper's knowledge, the British building still intimidated and mystified me. The terror stemmed from more than vines creeping up walls or the graffitied innards of the haunted house. It was the place's unearthly aura, lingering evil from the horrors that unfolded 20 years earlier. Why did Harper have to tell me where she had hidden the tooth? My hypothesis is that the exactor had wormed its way into her mind. Maybe it finally succeeded in tricking her. I blame myself. Harper was careful for so many years. She lowered her guard around me, lost herself for a second, and that was all the exactor needed. As soon as Harper had exhausted her usefulness, she was slaughtered. I can still see her mangled neck draped over the rigid back of that plastic canteen chair. The basement was a lightless hovel that carried a damp smell. I illuminated the cobweb-ridden room with my phone, and something elicited a blood-curdling scream from my hoarse throat. Amy. She was on her knees, shivering in the center of the room. She didn't even shield her eyes from my light. She only stared into my face with a blank and teary expression, and I realized something horrifying. The exactor was gone. I couldn't see the darkness in her eyes anymore, and if the creature had no use for servants, that could only mean one dreadful thing. The end was nigh. A bottle of hydrochloric acid confirmed that. It lay beside a gaping hole in the floorboard's woodwork. Amy had destroyed Harper's tooth, the only thing giving our eyes the power to imprison those frightful entities in their painted cells. My family's dead," Amy sobbed. It was as if she had been in a trance for years, and only at that moment, decades later, could she finally process the awfulness of what had befallen her loved ones. "Don't worry," I said. "Soon everybody's gonna be dead." The woman bawled, and I wanted to emphasize, but I kept seeing her younger sister's neck, the very neck that Amy had viciously snapped several hours before. It was hard to trust her. "How long has it been?" I asked, pointing at the acid-formed hole in the floor. "I destroyed it shortly before you arrived, within the hour perhaps," Amy absent-mindedly replied. I nodded. "How long do you think we have before the world ends?" She shrugged. "When I freed them as a child, they took time slithering out of the slab. They began constructing legions of creatures from the very dust of her house. Harper must have been upstairs for a couple of hours and the world didn't end. They occupied themselves with torturing my father and me, but I don't want to talk about that. I blocked that trauma so effectively from my mind that I didn't believe Harper's stories for years." "Whatever," I sighed. "Let's just savor Earth's final hours before hell opens up." "Listen, I've been reading my father's texts," Amy sniffed. "The ones left in this ransacked house anyway. If we hurry, we could maybe—" "Oh, I think it's over," I coldly stated. Amy's eyes sharpened and her brow furrowed as she locked her gaze onto mine. But it wasn't evil that I saw in her eyes. Not the exactor. No, it was resolve. The dying dregs of a desperate human's resolve. That's it? What about Kara? She asked. Are you just going to let everything end? Well, what can we do? As we speak, the horrors are crawling out of their paintings. It won't be long before they wreak havoc upon mankind. And we're not exactly artists, so I doubt that we could whip up. I trailed off, possessed by an inspired idea. The covered paintings on the gallery's top floor. Exact copies of the ones downstairs, I whispered. Amy slowly nodded, gathering my drift. Right. Harper's backups. Backups, she used to say. The name etching ritual. It must be performed by the original artist, I asked. Amy shrugged. Well, the texts only dictate that the one who uses a sacrificial etching tool, their tooth will bind the apocalyptic abhorrences to drawn likenesses. So if I were to etch my name into each of Harper's backup paintings, I thoughtfully whispered, delicately tapping one of my teeth, but then I sighed. We're miles from England. Thousands will have died in the time that we reached the gallery. Amy's eyes widened. You know, there are other ancient rituals that our father detailed in his translated texts. Mayans, Incas, and other ancient cultures learned things that modern people have forgotten. When their cities fell to ruins, these survivors utilized centuries of spiritual teachings to encage the exactor and its legions in prisons. But they used the power of art for other things too. What ritual could save us? I asked. A painting of the gallery, she answered. A doorway to the real gallery. My blood froze. I immediately recalled my terrifying experience in prison, being trapped in a painting that I truly believed to be reality. Harper had freed me from that hellish place with an exit doorway. I swore to myself that I would stay firmly grounded in the real world for the rest of my life, but Amy was suggesting that I willingly step back into that existential hellishness. And how would I ever know that I've returned to the real world? I asked. Now, this wouldn't be like any of the other paintings. It would be a portal, not a prison. You can feel the differences between painted color and real color. Trust me, she said. Even when you were in prison, part of you always knew that something was wrong. Can you deny that? Amy was right. A painted lie could never convince a person forever, but how could I be sure? And then I considered the alternative option, the total extinction of humanity. But we're back at square one, I pointed out. We need a painting of the art gallery to serve as the portal. Do you know how to paint? Can you create a believable likeness of the art gallery on a canvas? I certainly can't. I think you underestimate just how many paintings my sister created in her youth, Amy said, smiling. She guided me out of the basement on shaky legs, continuing to explain things. We had moved to England because Harper couldn't bear this place anymore, but we also moved because I had business contacts in your country. Anyway, I found the perfect little spot for my teenage sister's art gallery. Amy continued her story as we clambered up the creaky stairs. So, what was the first thing my sister did when I showed her the property? She painted the new prison for her macabre paintings. She said that it gives a place power to be included in the ritual. Of course, I didn't believe in her deluded ramblings back then. I had convinced myself that none of these supernatural horrors really happened on the night of our father's breakdown. Anyway, Harper left the painting at this house, along with many others. She said she would do a better one at some point. Do you think it's a good enough likeness of the art gallery to work as a teleporter? I asked. Amy gulped. I really hope so. I don't want you to become trapped in some non-existent painted realm. A half-human, half-paint splintered thing. No thanks. Great pep talk, I said. It really makes me want to do this. Amy opened the door to Harper's bedroom and matter-of-factly replied, It's not like you have a choice, is it? Unless you want me to do it. I shook my head. Inside Harper's old bedroom, a stack of half-finished paintings lay on her dusty, neglected duvet. Amy and I sifted through the pile, eventually finding Harper's early attempt at creating prison. Obviously, before moving to England and turning the property into an art gallery, Harper's visions of grandeur were a teenage fantasy. Fortunately, her painted vision was not too far removed from what the art gallery became. I wanted to do something for her, Amy somberly explained, tearily cradling the painting. After Mom and Dad died, Harper wasn't the same. I thought a place for her art would help her heal as much as the paintings horrified me. I didn't want to talk about Harper. The horror was too fresh, too raw. How do we turn prison into a portal? I asked. Sacrifice, Amy quietly replied. It's always about sacrifice. So another tooth? I asked. To bend the construct of space, Mayans bent the mind. That's what my dad wrote, Amy said, handing me a bottle of Jack Daniels. I laughed. You're kidding with me. I need to drink to save the world. To travel elsewhere, you have to loosen the connection to your present position in space and time. Amy replied with a deadpan expression. I guess harder drugs might work, but this is all I've got. A bottle of Jack. I planned on drinking myself to death after all. I slugged most of the liquid down my throat, ignoring the burning sensation and the desire to vomit. Touch the canvas, Amy instructed, and repeat the following words after me. Try to pronounce each syllable clearly. I placed my hands on the painting. Miss Andrews began to speak in an ancient language and I followed suit. After several minutes, the alcohol had started to hit my system and I had to concentrate incredibly hard. I didn't want to slur a single letter. The colors of the painting started to swirl and then something horrifying happened. My flesh began to melt. I shrieked, truly believing that Amy Andrews had deceived me. I watched my skin liquefy, meshing with the canvas, and my jaw dropped in terror. It's working, Amy cried. Good luck, Frank. What about you? I murmured, slipping into the canvas. Amy smiled tearily. Every ritual demands a sacrifice, Frank. The line between fiction and reality disintegrated. What remained of Harper's bedroom had transformed into a swirling whirl of painted colors, but I saw Amy Andrews clearly. I saw that blue painted tear trickle down her peachy cheek. I saw the blade that she produced from her pocket. The colors had started to mix, but I knew what she did. I tried to scream at the horrifying sight, but my face was composed of a melting and painted liquid. My limbs slowly warped out of shape and I felt nothing. That absence of sensation was the true terror. My eyesight blurred as the vibrant kaleidoscope of colors seemed to bulge and spiral. The painted art gallery grew to fill the room, and my body became sloshy paint on its canvas. And then I fell onto the darkened floor of the real art gallery. Nobody had been watching the paintings for hours, and not that it mattered. After the destruction of Harper's tooth, eyes were powerless against the exactor and its legions. The ritual had been broken. Resolving to fix that, I pulled myself to my feet. The world hadn't ended. There was time, but the gallery's eerie silence horrified me. Not as much as the first thing that I noticed, of course. Empty paintings. Every painting but Harper's Youth Dies had been abandoned by the monstrosities that I was supposed to guard. The girl sat in her painting with her faceless head in her hands. She was sobbing and I felt like doing the same. Her painted form seemed even more terrifying in the wake of the real Harper's diabolical demise. She mumbled, slipping her head out of her hands and motioning for me to come closer. As I did, she leaned out of her canvas. I placed my ear against her face, shuddering as it slipped beneath her flesh.
They're destroying the upstairs paintings, but they won't find the apocalypse.
Before I could ask what she meant, her canvas flopped out of its frame and softly floated to the tiled floor. My jaw hung agape as I saw the hidden painting on the back of Harper's Youth Dies. It depicted everything, every terrible entity, every apocalyptic situation necessary to keep the demons lost in their false paradise. Clearly, that hidden painting had always been Harper's real plan B. A more efficient way of trapping the creatures. Only one painting to watch, and only one name to etch. Heart throbbing against my chest, I plunged my hand into my mouth. Pinching a canine with my thumb and index finger, I took a deep breath. Closing my eyes, I tugged with all of my might. The pain was excruciating, but what made it worse was that I couldn't seem to free the slippery canine. I needed a tool to loosen the ritualistic tool. I ran over to the reception desk and rummaged around in the drawer for a pair of scissors. Another deep inhale, and then I slammed the blades into... sorry, I can't, it's too horrible. I eventually dislodged the tooth. The blood gushed in a free-flowing waterfall. Hand trembling, I victoriously held the canine up to my eye and began to laugh deliriously. I was inebriated and I'm sure that eased the pain, but it still hurt like crazy. Drunkenly stumbling towards the apocalypse, which lay on the ground, I finally saw the light at the end of the tunnel. And then the front door opened. "Frank?" Kara cried. "Where did you go?" I spun around, shakily outstretching an arm. "Kara, go home." My wife's eyes grew and she screamed at me. "Look out!" A heavy hand constricted my throat, not a human hand. I already knew what had seized me. The weighty wave of hopelessness and existential dread was unmistakable. As the hand hoisted me off the ground, the thing started to twist me around to face it. There, inches from my choking face, was the ghastly face of the exactor. Its wicked white eyes pierced mine, but that wasn't what filled me with horror. Its flesh wasn't sizzling under the weight of my gaze. No tooth, no imprisoning ritual, no power. And that ever-gaping, ever-slack mouth suddenly closed, as if the creature were no longer furious. In its place, the creature offered a smile. The most dreadful smile conceivable. The one I'm sure Amy and Harper saw on their father's face. The grin of a thing that had finally found a way to end mankind. I wheezed, gasping for air as the shirtless creature twice as tall as any human choked me. I had never felt so utterly petrified. I eyeballed the face of a boundless power, a thing older than time itself perhaps. The edges of my vision started to blacken, but I had no tricks up my sleeve. My eyes could no longer imprison it. And then I heard screaming. The exactor dropped me, more concerned with the spectacle in the main reception area. I turned to face my wife and I screeched. Harper's ghoul had seemingly fled its painting, the canvas which still lay on the floor displaying the apocalypse on the reverse side, and I could only watch in helpless horror as the faceless girl merged with Kara's body. The exactor unleashed its boat horn cry and its minions inexplicably seeped through the cracks in the tiles, slinking their slender bodies into the room, morphing their flat forms into full-bodied limbs. I wondered where the cavalry had been hiding, and I suddenly saw why they were so animated. Kara's eyes rolled into the back of her head and her body began to levitate. I screamed in horror, wondering why Harper had turned on me in my darkest hour. But then something incredible happened. "Oh," Kara said, eyes still rolling into the back of her head. "Now I see." The exactors began to lurch towards my hovering wife, and I watched in bewilderment as she flicked them aside. The exactor crept across the floor towards her, crunching the meager bodies of its henchmen beneath its feet. Kara and Harper couldn't kill the things, but they weren't trying to kill them. They were trying to buy time for me. I crawled across the floor, breathlessly spluttering from the swollen neck that the exactor had given me. And when I reached the apocalypse, I opened the palm of my clenched hand to reveal my bloody canine. Writing tool in hand, I finally started to etch two crucial words. Frank Hull. Those choral screams sounded again, the symphony of dying people, but it wasn't real. It wasn't real, and that was a good thing. It meant the exactor was trying to get in my head, and it meant the ritual had worked. I looked up to see a gaping mouth of fury on the 10-foot-tall ghoul's face. Its minions began to decompose, turning into blackened masses of paint, much as Harper had described. The creatures slipped into the apocalypse, imprisoned in a painting once more. The exactor held on to our world for dear life, screeching under the weight of my eyes upon it. His flash was a blazing inferno, and he released one final cry of agony before slipping into the painting of the apocalypse. I ran over to my wife, who was lying on the floor in a dazed state. "I just wanted to see her place of work again," she croaked. I cried with laughter, relieved that my wife was okay. "What the heck happened back there?" Kara coughed. "I came to save you." "No, I mean." "Oh, right, the demonic possession. It was still me in there. Harper just showed me the way." "Honestly, I thought you learned your lesson the last time that you strolled in here," I said. Kara smiled weakly. "I had to save you." But the evening's shocks didn't end with the re-imprisonment of the exactor and the other demons. In the early morning hours of my shift, Amy Andrews walked through the door. I gasped, eyeing the bandaged stump that used to be her right arm. I had misinterpreted the severity of the sacrifice she had made, and I think that news saved my fractured mind. I couldn't handle any more death. Amy's family had suffered enough. Amy suffered enough, locked out of her own mind for 20 years. I intend to keep her far away from the exactor, so that he never gets his claws into her again. We've talked about the future of the art gallery, but there's only one painting that really matters anymore. There's only one that's still fully intact: the apocalypse. And well, Harper's youth dies on the reverse side, but that's our little secret. Miss Andrews said that I can keep the job, and she's hired somebody else to watch the place during the day. Somebody that we can trust. Somebody who understands the importance of the art gallery. Kara. I wasn't too happy about my wife being involved, but nobody can be shielded from the apocalypse. No risks can be taken. Too much is at stake. I'm a security guard who works the night shift at an art gallery, and I think I need a raise. I was going to escape. Not by digging a tunnel or scaling a wall or bribing a guard. I was going to escape by studying. You see, I lived in a small town miles from anywhere, and the older that I got, the more it felt like I was imprisoned. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do, no jobs with prospects. My prison did not have any perimeter walls, but its dusty main road, dreary buildings, and stifling atmosphere felt just as bad to me. That was why I needed to get out. I was going to work hard at school. I was going to read the textbooks that I was meant to read, rather than the graphic novels about warped superheroes, which had been my go-to literature in the past. I was going to spend time using the online resources recommended by my teachers, not immersed in games set after an apocalypse. With the grades that I got as a result of this, there would be a whole load of academic institutions that would welcome me with open arms. All the ones that I had applied to were a long way from my hometown. I would have well and truly escaped. But it didn't work out like that. I couldn't finish a single chapter in a textbook or stay on the right page online before my attention wandered to something more interesting. The TV, a free trial of a must-play game, a new novel. I was surrounded by distractions. What chance did I have? So, by the time that I had handed my essays in and sat in the tests, I was no more educated than I had been a few months before. I had watched some great shows, zapped my way to close to a record score, and read some amazing graphic novels. But none of those counted in my favor as far as the universities were concerned. My applications were all dead in the water and I was stuck. A lifer. One morning a few weeks ago, I was staring into my bowl at the cereal and I sighed. I sighed a lot. My dad was pouring more syrup over his pancakes and my mom was drinking iced tea and reading a magazine. I sighed again. My mom looked up from her magazine. The people on the front cover all looked like $1 million but were wallowing in scandal according to the captions. "You know what you need," she said. Here comes a lecture, I thought, and I didn't even have the strength to sigh. "What you need to do," she continued, "is to get a job. The convenience store out of town is hiring. My cousin Betty saw a sign in their window." I moved the cereal around inside the bowl with my spoon and thought that for once my mom was right. It was time for me to take drastic measures. It was time for me to get a job. I told myself that it would just be a temporary thing as well, working in a store. Because I would reapply to the universities after I had done some serious studying, and then resat my tests and resubmitted my essays, and gained dazzling grades. And then I would be gone, a free man. I headed for the door and made a vow that this time I would stick to the plan. The store that Mom had been talking about was situated by the road in scrubland outside of town. There were no other buildings and I guessed people shopped there because they were passing by, and it was easier than finding somewhere that looked less shabby. As I got out of the car and looked up at the faded lettering painted in the window saying, "Open 24 hours a day, and we've got buckets of bargains," I started to have second thoughts. No one in my hometown ever went to this store as far as I knew. Everybody shopped at the local discount store on Main Street and swore that it was the best in the world. It was run by one family and it had been forever, so there was no chance of me getting a job there. I hesitated. I really did need to do something to change my life, and if that was getting a job in the out-of-town convenience store, then so be it. Sometimes you just have to reach for the stars, or push the door and step inside. There was air conditioning on in the store, but all its energy seemed to be going on making a loud rattling noise, rather than lowering the temperature. Conscious that I was dripping with sweat, I wiped my sleeve across my forehead and tried to flatten down my hair, so that I looked smart enough to hire. I hadn't been able to see a notice in the window advertising for staff, but was working on the assumption that they were still looking, and that a bright and eager young man like me, with no hair sticking up as far as I could tell, would be a definite for the job. Now I just needed to find somebody in charge. There was a couple of tills near the entrance staffed by two lethargic-looking men. They didn't look much older than me. One of them had a wispy mustache growing above his upper lip and the other had a tattoo coiling up his neck. They both wore t-shirts with "Ask me about today's special deals" printed on them. Neither had batted an eyelid at me, and knowing what today's special deals were would have to wait as far as I was concerned, so I ignored them and headed down one of the numerous aisles. The shelves were stacked high with cans and boxes and packs of food and household items. The arranging of them looked pretty chaotic to me at first glance, with things like jars of coffee balanced on sacks of dry dog food, bookended by apples that were starting to turn. But what did I know? I was new to the retail industry, but keen to learn. I thought this as I looked around for any sign of someone who might be a manager. There were a handful of shoppers piling cans and the rest in trolleys, and another young man who must have worked there because he was restocking shelves and wearing a matching t-shirt, but there was still no sign of a boss. I reached the end of the aisle and was standing there deciding whether to go left or right, when I realized that I was being eyeballed. The man who was staring at me was dressed in a beige uniform that looked vaguely like the type that law enforcement officers wore. But he was no cop. He was clearly a store security guard. and it turned out that he seemed to think that I was up to no good. He stuck out his chest and growled, "I've been keeping my eyes on you boys since you came in the store. You don't seem much interested in buying anything, but you are having a good look round. You sizing the joint up, boy. You planning a heist?" His voice rose in volume as he said these last words. I figured he was hoping that I would crack under pressure and admit that I was a desperado, but instead I said, "No sir, I'm just looking for a job." His chest deflated, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone up a couple of octaves. "Oh well, dang. I thought there was going to be some action here. Dang. You said you're looking for a job. Come with me." And with that he wheeled sharply away and set off walking along the ends of the aisles. I fell into step behind him. At last, I seemed to be getting somewhere. We walked past the last of the aisles, around precarious-looking stacks of empty boxes, over a cable coiled across the floor, and into a narrow corridor at the end of which was a door with a small sign on it saying, "Store Manager." "You don't want to knock on here, son," the security guard said. "Then good luck." And then he strode off, with a determined expression on his face. Desperados of the world beware, I thought. I flattened down my hair one last time and then I knocked on the door. A woman's voice drifted out telling me to enter. I turned the handle and I went in. The office was cramped and poorly lit, and dominated by a desk that was overflowing with paper. The woman who was sitting behind the desk smiled at me. Now, some people say that you shouldn't judge on first impressions. Others say that the first 5 seconds after you meet someone new determines the rest of your relationship, professional or otherwise, for the duration. The woman behind the desk looked tired and kind of sad, kind of weighed down, and I immediately liked her. People that radiated success were my antimatter. Whether it was the popular and good-looking kids at school or entrepreneurs online, I felt driven away from them. People like this woman who appeared to find life a struggle were much more my type. I would say that she was in her late 30s. She wore a dark business suit and had blonde hair that hung loose. Her jacket had a lot of stray blonde hairs on it, and I noticed as well that her fingernails were bitten to the quick. She was still looking at me and smiling, and I realized that she was waiting for me to say something. I thought quickly and came up with the less than brilliant opening line of, "Hi, how you doing today?" "Oh yes, hello," she said, her smile wavering. "I'm okay, thank you. I'm Donna, the store's manager. Can I help you with something? Do you have a complaint about something that you bought here? Our no returns policy is clearly marked throughout the store." After a moment's confusion, I worked out that she thought that I was an unhappy customer. "Oh no, I'm actually here hoping that you would give me a job." "I see," she replied. "Do you have any retail experience? And do you have your resume with you and the names and contact details of 2 referees?" I had none of those things, so I stood there feeling flustered. Getting a job was stressful. She looked at me. Her eyes were blue and a bit bloodshot and impossible to read. I couldn't tell whether she was about to tell me to stop wasting her time and leave or take pity on me. She turned her attention to the storm of papers strewn across her desk. She extracted one sheet, studied it for a moment, and then turned back to me and said, "I don't have any vacancies in the day shift, which leaves the night shift. For the night shift, I prefer to hire those who might struggle to find work elsewhere. I believe in giving them a chance to earn an honest living, no matter what baggage they might have. You're clearly an ordinary kid whose face fits in the crowd, so you don't need a helping hand from me. But having said that, I am short of staff for the night shift this week, so I could offer you temporary work. How does that sound?" It wasn't what I had been hoping for, but I decided to go for it. "It sure is," I said. "What time do I start?" Her smile turned to full beam and then she told me, "The night shift starts tonight at 10 p.m., so if you arrive 20 minutes early, You can have your introduction before you begin your first shift." And then we shook hands and that was it. I was employed. I went home and spent the rest of the day in a happy daze. I imagined how this could be the start of a brilliant career for me. I might not even need to go to university. I'd be such a success in the night shift that I would be offered the job of deputy store manager, and within a few months, I would be running my own store and then my own chain of stores. I'd be a millionaire by 30. I would have a sports car and a private jet, and my girlfriend would be a fashion model. I might even be on the front of a glossy magazine. The front door closed and I heard my mom calling out, "You better have done your chores." It brought me back down to reality. I looked around the kitchen. The sink was still piled high with dishes. The refuse bin was overflowing. "I'm sorry, I don't have time," I called back. "I have to go to work." And then I hurried out the back door. I made my getaway and then parked up a couple of miles away and sent my mom a message explaining about my new job at the store and how that I would see her and Dad for breakfast. Then I put my phone in my pocket and I drove on. I didn't want to be late for my first night at work. As it was, I was early. There had been zero traffic on the road to slow me down, not a single vehicle heading the same way. In fact, I didn't even see headlights in the distance. By the time that I parked up outside the store, I was wondering if the night shift was going to be very quiet and intensely boring. Sitting there, watching the evening sky redden, I hardly saw any customers entering or leaving the store. Yep, I thought. They call this a graveyard shift for a reason. By the time that I dragged myself out of my car and trudged over to the store, I was feeling as lethargic as the two till clerks that looked earlier. They were still there, sitting by their tills in these stupid t-shirts, serving no one. Once again, they ignored me. And once again, I blinked at them as I walked on by. I saw the same security guard patrolling the aisles and gave him a thumbs up. "Hey, I got the job," I called over to him. He grinned back and I carried on to the manager's office. Her door was open, so I went right in. She had had her head in her hands and I had the awful feeling that she might have been crying, which left me standing there wondering if I should say something or quietly back out of the room. I was still trying to decide when she looked up. "Hi again, it's me," I said, once more displaying my brilliant conversational skills. She sniffed and dabbed at her eyes with a tissue and told me to follow her. Relieved that we were skirting over the whole her being upset thing, I did just that. It was time for my introduction. She showed me where the fire exit was in the staff room for when it was my break. She showed me the storeroom and the walk-in refrigerated area where perishable goods were kept before they were put out for sale. This was basically a very chilly room that made my teeth chatter while I stood there listening to her explain. There was a small door at the far side of this room marked "Deep Freeze." There was another sign below spelling out in red letters, "No entry." I was about to ask her what was in there when she led me back out and to the front of the store. The lethargic store assistants were getting ready to leave, along with the other assistant that I had seen stacking shelves in the morning and the security guard as well. Donna said goodbye to them in turn, and that left just the two of us in the store as far as I could see. She smiled and said, "The rest of the night shift staff will be here soon. In the meantime, are you good with manning the fort?" I answered with a smile of my own and she laughed. I scratched my head and I looked out the window. It was dark by now, a clear night though. I yawned and was still yawning when the door opened and the oldest man that I had ever seen in my life had walked in. His wrinkles had wrinkles. His eyes were watery and most of the hair on his head was sprouting from his ears. He was stooped forward and walking incredibly slowly and wheezing every step of the way. He was also wearing the beige imitation cop uniform of a security guard. Now, I was brought up to respect my elders, and honestly I did. But this was one ancient dude. No way that he could cut it as any kind of enforcer of law and order, even in a convenience store in the middle of nowhere. He lifted his head to look at me, and I was surprised that there wasn't a creaking sound, and then he carried on his way, inch by torturous inch. I shook my head, and then I noticed that someone else had appeared while I was watching the security guard. The girl walking through the door was about my age. She was 5'0" tall and had long jet black hair that matched her fingernails and lipstick. She also had very pale skin or makeup on, which made her look washed out in a cool goth kind of way. I knew even less about makeup than I knew about girls. The color of night trend continued with her clothes. Her knee-length dress was paired with black stockings and black boots. Despite the cooling temperature of the late hour, I started to feel hot again. She was gorgeous, and she had noticed that I was staring at her. My cheeks began to burn. An 18-year-old man blushing was not a good look, I knew, but there was nothing that I could do about it, and she was headed right towards me. "Hey," she said. "I'm Katie. You must be new here. It's nice to meet you." She held out her hand. I stared at it for far too long, knowing that I was meant to shake it, but the signal between my brain and my hand had gone missing. I made a grunting sound instead and waved at her, even though she was just standing a few feet in front of me. She looked embarrassed and sounded unsure when she said, "Well, welcome to the team. I look forward to working with you." And then she headed off, leaving me standing there feeling like the complete loser that I was. I grimaced and shook my head, and tried to think of a reason that I could resign and go home and hide in my room. My train of thought was interrupted by the sight of two more new arrivals. They were now moving as slowly as the security guard, but they were shuffling along at a very sedated pace. They had vacant expressions on their faces, and when neither of them acknowledged me, I knew that these two must be working the tills. And sure enough, they lowered themselves into the seats behind the little conveyor belts and sat there looking like the dictionary definition of lethargic. I left them to it and I wandered down an aisle. The manager had explained to me earlier that one of my tasks was to check for any gaps on the shelves and to restock them. I was considering a display of giant value cereal boxes when Katie had reappeared. She was wearing a t-shirt over her dress which read, "Our prices will still be low when the sun rises." I saw that she had another 3 identical t-shirts draped over her arm. She smiled and held one out to me. I didn't think before I opened my mouth and said, "Oh, no way do I have to wear one of those. They're so dumb." Katie flinched and lifted her feet. "Oh, okay," she said. "It's just that I make them myself. I want to work in fashion and Donna pays me a bit extra to create new t-shirts for the staff and build up my portfolio." Still not looking at me, she walked away. I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me at that point. Until a few minutes ago, there had been the fraction of a chance of anything romantic happening between me and this beautiful young woman. Now there was 0 likelihood. I smacked my forehead with the palm of my hand and said out loud, "Idiot," and then I went back to looking for gaps on the shelves. But my heart was not in it, and as time dragged on, and the occasional shopper drifted by in the background, I found myself standing back near the tills. I had not replenished a single thing, and it was not even midnight, and I understood now as well why the 2 till assistants looked so devoid of enthusiasm. One of them was serving a customer, slowly moving each item over the scanner, and when it had beeped, putting the item in a cardboard bag. There was a dull rhythm to this which was strangely hypnotizing, and I found myself listening for the beep of the scanner, watching his hand carrying the item across, listening for the beep. And then I noticed a fly circling his head, and another one crawling across his cheek, and this brought me out of my daze. He did not seem to be aware of the flies though. He just continued swiping. The other till assistant, meanwhile, was staring blankly into space. They were both wearing one of Katie's t-shirts. As I looked at these, I felt a fresh wave of regret and decided that I needed to snap out of it and to do the right thing. I went to find her to apologize and to tell her that I really wanted a t-shirt. She was in the storeroom opening yet another cardboard box. I took a deep breath and I went in. "Hey, I'm sorry about earlier. I was wondering if I could still have a t-shirt. You know, to be a part of the team. I mean, you've got one on and both the guys at the tills. Sorry, I don't know their names." "It's Frank and Frank," she told me. She sounded and looked brighter when she said this, and my spirits rose as well. "Seriously?" I replied with a smile on my face. "They're both called Frank." She nodded. "Yeah, I think so. They never really talk, so it's hard to be sure. But that's what I call them, and neither of them had ever corrected me." "Hey, fair enough," I said. "How about the security guard? Is he Frank as well?" She laughed, and that made me feel even better. "Oh no, silly," she said. "That's Mr. Oliver. He's lovely, and he's a very good security guard." I didn't try and say anything funny about his age. I just agreed, and when Katie told me that she had to get back to work, I returned to my shelf, checking with a spring in my step. A little while later, Katie walked past and smiled at me. I had noticed that she never seemed to show her teeth when she smiled. She must have had a retainer, I figured, and was self-conscious about it. Something which made her even more attractive in my eyes. I moved to a new aisle, still looking for those gaps. My mind soon started wandering again, and I started feeling bad for not checking to see if my mom had replied to my message. I assumed using a phone while working was frowned on, so I checked and there was no sign of the manager, so I took out my phone. There was a reply from my mom sent not long after I had messaged her. She said that she was happy that I had followed her advice and asked if I was rushed off my feet. That made me laugh. I was the opposite. I thought the best way to explain would be to send her a little film of the deserted aisles. Keeping my phone low to try and be discreet, I turned on the camera and, without looking into it, panned across the aisle. Capturing a whole lot of nothing, I thought only just at the moment that Katie walked past the end of the aisle that I had been filming. I turned the camera off, but she had not noticed me and was soon out of sight. I considered not sending the video to my mom, but decided, hey, what the heck. Katie would have only been in it for a couple of seconds. My mom wouldn't care. I attached the clip and pressed a reply to my mom's message, and then immediately hid the phone back in my pocket. I didn't want to push my luck. With rule breaking over, I went back to the shelves and their gaps. Around 2 a.m., Donna came out of her office and told me that it was time for my 20-minute break. My stomach was grumbling, but I had not brought anything to eat or drink with me, which wasn't a problem considering where I was. I got some chips, a pepperoni stick, and a can of cola off the shelves, and I went to the tills to pay. There were no customers. The security guard was sat on a plastic chair by the entrance. His head was drooping, and I think that he might have been asleep. The two assistants, the two Franks, if Katie was right about their names, were sat at their tills looking blankly ahead. There were more flies on them, and it struck me for the first time that their skin had a grayish tint to it. "Hey," I said to them, "I guess it doesn't matter which one of you guys serves me." A pretty dumb thing to say, but I was trying to be friendly. The two Franks turned their heads slowly and gazed at each other for a minute. As crazy as it sounds, it felt like they were almost having a silent conversation. And then one of them looked at me and raised his hand. I figured he was indicating that he would serve me, so I put my items on his conveyor belt. Grindingly slowly, he picked each up in turn and moved them over the scanner. 3 beeps sounded. I paid, picked up my stuff, and headed to the staff room. When I arrived, my heart did a little jump. Katie was there. She was engrossed in reading a paperback book, but looked up as I entered. I apologized for disturbing her. "No, it's not a problem," she replied and closed the book. "So, how's your first shift going?" she asked. Feeling delighted that she wanted to know, I grinned at her and said, "Not bad. I just got served by one of the Franks. It was a bit of an odd experience." "Oh, don't worry about it," she told me. "They're a bit eccentric, sure, but I like them. They live out by the old military base. There's a whole community out there living off-grid. I've been past and seen them, but I've never visited. I think most of them are ex-military that used to work at the base." I nodded enthusiastically. The old military base was one of those places my parents had always warned me to avoid, though they had never really said why. There were rumors about secret experiments and cover-ups, but I'd always dismissed those as conspiracy theories. I was considering if I should ask Katie if she wanted to drive out there in the daytime and see what was really going on, when she got to her feet and told me that she needed to get back to work. I was left with butterflies in my stomach and thinking how hanging out with Katie was the most amazing thing. And then I demolished my snacks and went back to work. I was getting the hang of my job by now and learning where everything was in the storeroom when I needed to replenish a shelf. I was carrying a 4-pack of tinned fruit to its new home, feeling pleased with myself when I saw a customer standing halfway along an aisle. He was tall and skinny and was wearing a long baggy coat that was too big for him. There was something about him that set off an alarm bell in my head, and I paused, wondering if he was up to no good. And sure enough, he reached out, picked up a big block of cheese and put it inside his coat, and then he moved down the aisle and did the same with a tin of processed meat. My heart began to race. This guy was a shoplifter, and somebody needed to challenge him. If the security guard that I had met the day before had been on duty, I would have found him and told him what was happening, and he could have taken care of the thief. But standing there as the man pocketed another tin, I thought about the old ancient security guard. He would be no use whatsoever. I made a decision. I put down the tins that I was carrying and I walked towards the shoplifter with a determined expression on my face. "You," I said, trying to sound like I meant business. "I saw what you're doing." He looked at me. There was a coldness in his eyes. He didn't look in the least a bit scared of me. He even started to smile. I swore to myself, realizing that I had made a mistake, but it was too late for me to back out now. He was muttering obscenities at me, and his fists were clenched. And suddenly, he lashed out. His punch hit me on the chin and I fell backwards as pain flared from where I had been struck. Then as he stepped over me, he brought his boot down onto my stomach. The pain from this new blow took my breath away and I curled up into a ball to try and protect myself. But he was walking away. I heard him laugh and then lost sight of him. And I was lying there groaning when I heard someone say, "What's happened?" I glanced up and it was Donna, and Katie was behind her. They both looked shocked and concerned. I tried to sit up. "This man, he was stealing things," I managed to say. "I tried to stop him." Donna and Katie both came over to me and helped me to my feet. And then Donna shook her head and said, "You shouldn't have done that. You might have been seriously injured or worse. Next time, you alert the security guard and let him handle things. Is that clear?" She was clearly angry with me, and that surprised me. I could only mumble an apology and a promise that it would never happen again. Still shaking her head, Donna asked Katie to take me to the staff room and sit with me for a while to check that I was okay. Back in the staff room, I rubbed my chin and felt my stomach, and decided the only serious harm that had been done was to my pride. "Hey, don't feel bad," Katie told me. "Donna used to run the store with her husband. They were childhood sweethearts and got married around the time that they took on the place. Last year, her husband confronted a shoplifter. The man turned violent and Donna's husband was badly injured. Her voice started to break. She took a deep breath and said, "He died." I understood then why Donna had reacted the way that she had to my naive attempt to stop the shoplifter. After asking me if I was going to be alright, Katie went back to work and I was left with a lot to think about. Not least the fact that I was by now hopelessly in love with Katie. I wanted to marry her and live in a house with a picket fence. We would have 3 children and a barbecue in the backyard every Sunday in the summer. Of course, I would have to get the courage to ask her out on a date first, and then sooner rather than later introduce her to my parents. Thinking of them made me remember the last message that I had sent my mom. Wondering if she had seen it and replied, I took out my phone. The words, "Message failed to send," was on the screen, and I saw that I had no reception. It wasn't a problem. My mom was probably fast asleep anyway, and I would be seeing her in only a few hours. I started to put my phone back into my pocket and then I stopped. I wanted to watch the film so that I could see the few seconds that Katie had been in it. She was so beautiful. I pressed play. The view passed along the shelves and along the empty aisle until it reached the end where Katie had walked past and should have been caught on film. But she wasn't there. It was only more empty space. Frowning, I pressed play again. No, she wasn't in the film, which was weird. I was about to check for a 3rd time when Donna stuck her head around the door and asked me how I was feeling. I wanted to tell her how sorry I was about her husband, but I figured that now wasn't the best time. So I told her that I was fine and ready to get back to work. There must have been a few more customers in because there were new gaps on the shelves. Not for long, I said out loud to myself and set off to the storeroom. After a while, I started to feel hungry again. A candy bar that I could eat while working would be ideal, I thought, and after choosing one, I headed to the tills. The security guard was still by the entrance, still borderline comatose. The Franks were still staring off into space. And the door was opening and 2 men were entering the store. They had plastic masks covering their faces and they were armed. I froze. This was a nightmare, one that unfolded at speed. One of the intruders began to shout, telling us not to do anything stupid. The other checked out the rest of the store, returning moments later with Katie and Donna. They had their hands on their heads and looked as terrified as I felt. And then the first intruder yelled at the Franks to open their tills, which they did but at their own slow pace. This drove the intruder crazy and he began to scream at them. Katie began to cry and this got her screamed at as well. Everything was escalating, and I had a sickening feeling that someone was going to get badly hurt. The only person that was not freaking out was the ancient security guard, Mr. Oliver. All the shouting had woken him up, but he was just sitting in his chair by the entrance. He scratched his chin and looked at the intruders. "Now then, fellas," he said, his voice scratchier than an old vinyl record. "There's no need for all this threatening. Why don't you head on out and we'll forget about this whole thing?" The intruders looked at him for a minute and then burst out laughing. Mr. Oliver tutted and said, "I gave you a fair warning." And then he got slowly to his feet. There was a cracking sound as he did. I thought this was his old bones protesting and having to move. And he did wince as if he was in pain. And then he arched his back and his arms reached out, and he began to change. Thick dark hair began to grow from his face and his hands. His fingers stretched out, and he kept on growing. The nails on the end of each finger were lengthening as well. I watched in horror as they changed into razor-sharp claws. The rest of his body was also expanding. His uniform tore open in places to reveal not skin but a pelt. His shoes split and paws were exposed, each tipped with a vicious-looking claw. The feeble, slow old man had been transformed into a wolf that stood upright. It threw back its head and howled and then turned its gaze on the intruders. Its fangs glistened with drool, and its eyes sparkled with murderous intent. Transfixed by fear, the intruders stared at the creature which the old man had become. It began to snarl and took a step towards them. The intruders dropped their weapons, turned tail, and ran out of the store. I stood there with my mouth hanging open. I began to say. I wanted to say shapeshifter, but surely they only existed in the realms of comic books and TV series. And yet there was one standing a few feet from me. It was no longer snarling and was not showing any signs of aggression to those of us left in the store. And then things got even more bizarre. Donna walked up to the creature and patted its arm and said, "Thank you, Mr. Oliver. I don't think we'll have any more trouble from those two." In response, the creature smiled. I swear on all that's good it did. It smiled and then sat down and shrunk back into an old man. His uniform was still torn, his shoes split open, but now all there was wrinkly skin and chipped toenails. My mouth was still open. Donna noticed and turned to me and said, "Other businesses wouldn't employ Mr. Oliver as a security guard because of his age. Well, I saw past that and gave him a chance. This is not the first time that he has repaid my trust." And then she headed back in the direction of her office. Katie, meanwhile, was giving Mr. Oliver a hug. The Franks were nodding slowly. I finally shut my mouth and went to the restroom. I needed to splash some cold water on my face. I went back to work after this, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had just witnessed. I had to know more, and for that, I needed to go all the way to the top. I finished replacing some kitchen rolls and detergent bottles and then went to the manager's office. On the way, I saw her going into the refrigerated area. Maybe she needs to cool down as well after all the excitement, I thought, with a nervous smile on my face, and I followed her. She had already crossed the length of the room by the time that I entered, and was opening the door marked "Deep Freeze." I carried on after her but hesitated at the door. The sign saying "No entry" was clear. I shouldn't go in, but I was just so desperate for an explanation. I decided to go for it. I turned the handle and opened the door, very slowly and as quietly as I could. Basically, I was sneaking in and feeling guilty about it. Once the door was open wide enough, I peered into the room. It was dimly lit and waves of freezing air were making my skin burn, and the inside of my mouth because once again it was hanging open. Donna was standing in the middle of the room talking to a man who was frozen solid inside a large block of ice. Through the layer of ice, I could see that his veins beneath his pale skin and that his eyes were closed. Donna was speaking very quietly, and I couldn't hear what she was saying, but as I stood there watching, she smiled at the human popsicle, then blew it a kiss and turned away, and saw me. I was mortified. I knew that I shouldn't have been there. I started to mumble an apology, but Donna held up a hand to stop me and asked me to come with her to her office. I trailed after her. I was still shaking even after I left the cold rooms. I thought that I was about to be fired. She asked me to take a seat, which I gratefully accepted before my legs gave way. And then she looked at me and said, "The man you just saw me talking to was my husband. He was mortally wounded in a robbery attempt. I expect that Katie's already told you that. What she doesn't know is that after the incident, when I could see that he was dying, I dragged him into the deep freeze. I was out of my mind with shock, but a part of me was thinking that if I froze him, then I could keep him alive." Tears fell down her face as she spoke, and she didn't try and wipe them away as she went on. "Afterwards, I lied and told the other staff that I had called the paramedics and that the cops that they were on their way. And then I sent the staff home and closed the store. And after that, I went back into the deep freeze and sat with my husband and talked to him until dawn. All the while, the ice particles were forming around his body. And now every night, I go into the deep freeze and I talk to him. I tell him how the store's doing, and I tell him that I love him, and then I go back out to work. She finally wiped a hand across her cheek, and then she took a deep breath. So, that's it. That's my secret, she said. Acting with my heart rather than my head, I stood up and went over to her side of the desk and asked if it was okay to give her a hug. She nodded, so I held her gently for a moment and told her that her secret was safe with me. And then I did the only thing that I could think of. I went back to work. Dawn was only an hour or so away and I was feeling pretty wiped out, but I wasn't going to slack off. As well as my feelings for Katie, I had really come to like Donna and Mr. Oliver, and even the Franks too. And I knew that there was so much about them and the store that I was still to discover. That could wait until my next shift, I thought, because nothing else was going to happen that night. I couldn't have been more wrong. It started with the roar of a motorbike engine outside, and then a second and a third, and so they went. I hurried to the front of the store to see what was happening. The Franks were at their tills and Mr. Oliver was in his chair. Katie and Donna joined us moments later. We looked out into the darkness and saw half a dozen or so motorbikes lined up facing the store. The drivers revved their engines in turn. All the motorbikes had passengers and they were climbing off and staring at the store. They were all carrying. I felt a trickle of cold sweat run down my neck. This was trouble. "Who are they?" Katie asked. "Varmints," Mr. Oliver replied. "I can see the two lowlifes who tried robbing the store earlier. Looks like they brought their pack back with them to take revenge." The drivers were getting off their motorbikes as well, and it felt to me like there was a feral army out there, and that we were their prey trapped in the store. "We should call the cops," Katie said. By the time they get here, it'll be too late," Mr. Oliver replied. "I can take some of them out, but not enough." My heart sank even further. The odds of us getting out of this situation alive felt like they were dropping by the second. I turned to Donna, desperately hoping that she would have an idea to save us, but she was speaking quietly to the Franks. They were nodding slowly, seeming to understand, and when Donna finished, they rose and walked to the entrance, where they stood staring out into the distance. I got the feeling that they were staring beyond the biker gang, somehow reaching out deep into the scrublands. Whatever it was that they were doing, it did not matter anymore. The bikers were advancing in a ragtag line on the store. They were taking their time. They had their weapons propped on their shoulders and looked like they were enjoying this, taking sick pleasure from the terror that they must have known we were experiencing inside the store. Nausea rose inside me and I was on the verge of tears. I didn't want to die, not like this. And all the while the bikers came closer and closer, and all we could do was watch helplessly. And then Katie pointed into the distance. "Look," she exclaimed. I couldn't see what she meant at first, but then I saw them. There were figures approaching from the distance. They were moving slowly, walking with an odd and uneven gait. They were a shuffling, shambling group, and there were a lot of them, a couple of dozen, maybe more. "Who are they?" I asked breathlessly. The Franks answered, their voices overlapping. They said in a guttural drawl, "Frank." What the freaking? I began to think but never got to the end, because the bikers had seen that they had company now. One of the bikers span around and opened fire. He hit one of the approaching figures in the chest. It stopped in its tracks, looked down at the smoldering hole which ran all the way through its body, then raised its arms and bared its teeth, and started walking forward again, right at the biker who had fired at it. I couldn't see his face, but I heard his scream as the figure bit into his shoulder. And all around this gruesome encounter, more and more of the bikers were being overwhelmed by the strange figures which had emerged from the night and saved us. I turned away. With a hysterical laugh bubbling up inside me, I thought of a new staff t-shirt slogan, "Saved by Zombies." Because that's what those things must have been. Because that's what the Till Assistants, the Franks, were. And somehow they had called in the undead cavalry. It was all clear to me now. Zombies and a shapeshifter. Donna wasn't kidding when she had told me that she'd like to give the unemployable a chance. Adrenaline was still pulsing through my body and I felt lightheaded as I made my way back to the aisles and went back to work. Thankfully, it was going to be light soon, which meant my first night shift was almost over. I was too tired and stressed to summon up the courage to ask Katie out. That would have to wait for another time, and perhaps after we had worked a few more night shifts together, but I did want to say goodbye. After replacing my final item of the night, I went looking for Katie, but I couldn't see her, so I headed back towards the door. She must have left already, I figured, and I looked outside at the sky. Flecks of red were appearing at the edges of the darkness, and there was something moving up there, something dark and quick. That suddenly swooped down low so that it was only inches from the door, and I saw that it was a bat and that it was looking right at me. And another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Katie. Her pale skin, the way she smiled without showing her teeth, her camera not recording her. She was another of the strange. The girl that I loved was a vampire, and before dawn rose, she needed to be away. The bat soared back up into the sky. I watched it until it was only a dot and then gone, lost to sight. Until the next night shift, I thought, and I headed for my car.